Before we get into tonight's story, a quick thank you to Dogface680 for suggesting this one in the comments. We see every single suggestion, and this one was too good to pass up. If you're listening on Spotify, it would mean the world to us if you took 10 seconds to leave a review. It helps more people find the channel, and if you have a story you want us to cover next, drop it in the comments below. We read them all. Now, settle in, get comfortable. Because what you are about to hear is not a ghost story. It is not a legend passed down around a campfire. It is a paper trail. It begins in the American Southwest, on high desert mesas that have been inhabited for over 1,000 years. It begins with a people who said they had been watching the sky, the earth, and the patterns of human behaviour for centuries, and that they had seen all of this before. The Hopi people of northern Arizona are among the most historically documented indigenous cultures in North America. Their oral traditions, their ceremonial practices, and their cosmological understanding of cyclical time have been studied by anthropologists since the late 19th century. But there is a chapter of that story that never made it into university textbooks. In classified file rooms within the Department of Defense, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the Department of Energy, analysts spent decades doing something extraordinary. They were not studying the Hopi as a cultural curiosity. They were studying the Hopi prophecies as a potential intelligence asset. Because the numbers were aligning, the symbols were matching, and the timeline, according to internal government memorandums that were never meant to be read by the public, was accelerating. This is the story of what they found. This is the story of what was buried. And this is the story of one man who found the folder they tried to erase. The folder was called Fifth World Transition. You are already in the Fourth World, and if the Hopi elders were right, it is ending. It is 2 months after the Trinity test, July 16th, 1945, the New Mexico desert, a blinding white flash that turned sand into glass, a shockwave that rattled windows 160 miles away. The first nuclear detonation in human history had just occurred, and the men who witnessed it knew immediately that something irreversible had happened. J. Robert Oppenheimer, watching the mushroom cloud rise into the pale morning sky, recalled a verse from Hindu scripture. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Most of official Washington spent the next 2 months focused on military strategy, troop deployments, intelligence assessments, the mechanics of ending a world war. But in September of that same year, in the dusty fieldwork offices of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, a different kind of document was being compiled. 2 anthropologists working in northeastern Arizona had been conducting routine cultural documentation interviews near the ancient village of Aribe, which is widely considered the oldest continuously inhabited settlement in the United States. The interviews had been standard academic work, recording oral traditions, ceremonial calendars, agricultural practices. And then the elders stopped talking, not all at once, not rudely, but with the quiet, deliberate firmness of people who had made a collective decision. The anthropologists noted in their September report that the Hopi elders had agreed to provide no further interviews on matters of prophecy or ceremonial cosmology. The reason given, translated through an interpreter, was recorded almost verbatim in the document. The fire released by man has awakened what sleeps beneath the Fourth World. The anthropologists assumed this was a metaphor, a poetic response to news of the atomic bomb, which had reached even the most remote corners of the American Southwest by late summer. They filed the report. They noted the unusual phrasing. They forwarded the document to the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C., as required by protocol. The document was received. It was logged. And then, instead of being routed to the Cultural Archives division where it belonged, it was redirected. Military intelligence had been quietly monitoring communications tagged with certain keywords since early in the war. The phrase awakened, the phrase beneath, the phrase Fourth World. These had appeared in a handful of indigenous cultural reports over the previous decade, and a small office within the War Department had flagged them for follow-up. The report from Arizona became part of a collection that most historians never knew existed. It was not the last. His name was Frank Waters. He was an American author and researcher born in Colorado Springs at the beginning of the 20th century, and he had spent more of his adult life in the Southwest than anywhere else. He understood the land, he understood the people, and critically, he understood that the oral traditions of cultures like the Hopi were not mythology in the dismissive sense that mainstream academia sometimes used the word. They were records. Waters began formal interviews with Hopi elders around 1945 and continued them for years. He was granted access that most outsiders were not, in part because he approached the work with genuine respect, and in part because the elders, by that period, had made a deliberate decision. They had decided that certain things needed to be said out loud, in a language that could reach beyond the mesa. What Waters documented became the foundation of his landmark book, published in 1963, which provided the most comprehensive written account of Hopi cosmology available in English. The book described a cosmological framework that the Hopi had maintained for generations. Humanity, according to this framework, had not always lived in the world as it exists today. There had been previous worlds, each one a full cycle of human civilization, each one brought to an end not by randomness, not by accident, but by a predictable pattern. The first world had ended by fire, the second by ice, the third by water, a global catastrophe that the elders described in terms that sounded strikingly familiar to flood mythologies found on every continent. And the current world, the fourth world, the one in which all living human beings now reside, was described as being in its final phase. Waters recorded the symbolism carefully. He documented the prophecies as they were shared with him, but there was a layer beneath the published work that he acknowledged privately, in correspondence and in personal notes. Certain teachings had been deliberately withheld from publication at the direct request of the elders who shared them. These were the specific details, the specific timeline, the specific signs. Waters honoured that request, but others had already begun to take notice, because by 1948, the small office within what was now called the Central Intelligence Agency that had been tracking indigenous cultural reports had grown, and the name Frank Waters was on their list. His name was Dan Iwahima. He was a Hopi traditional leader, a keeper of his people's sacred knowledge, and by any reasonable measure one of the most important public voices of the 20th century that most people have never heard of. He was born on the Hopi mesas in the late 19th century. He grew up in a world that was rapidly being transformed by electricity, by railroads, by the industrial sprawl that was consuming the American landscape, and he watched, with the patience of a man who understood long cycles of time, as each technological development matched descriptions that had been passed down through generations of Hopi knowledge keepers. Throughout the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, Iwahima delivered warnings. He spoke to journalists, to spiritual communities, to activists, to anyone who would listen. His message was consistent. Humanity had entered a period of dangerous technological imbalance. The nuclear weapons that world powers had built and continued to expand represented a fundamental disruption of what he called cosmic harmony. And the signs of world transition, the signs that preceded the shift from one world cycle to the next, had already begun to manifest. He was specific. He described the signs using language that had been preserved for generations. He spoke of a time when the land would be crisscrossed with lines that carried voices over great distances. He spoke of gourds of ashes that would fall from the sky and poison the earth and the water for generations. He spoke of a house that would move through the heavens. He spoke of the wearing of symbols that had once belonged to enemies as if they were one's own, a cryptic reference that some interpreted as the adoption of the swastika, which had been a sacred symbol in many indigenous traditions before it became associated with National Socialism in Europe. He was not considered a threat by most Americans who encountered his message. To mainstream observers, he was an elderly indigenous man speaking in metaphors about ecology and spiritual responsibility. but in certain federal offices his speeches were being transcribed, analysed and filed under a classification level that did not belong in any cultural studies archive. Because what the analysts had noticed was not the general spiritual message, it was the specificity of the timeline. The official record, to the extent that any official record exists, describes it as a radiation monitoring program. In the early 1950s, with Cold War nuclear testing accelerating across the Nevada desert and the Pacific Ocean, the United States Geological Survey deployed a network of ground-based monitoring stations across the Southwest. The public rationale was straightforward. Nuclear tests produced measurable environmental contamination that could drift with wind patterns across the continental interior. It was responsible science to monitor the spread. The stations near northeastern Arizona were logged as part of this network. Their coordinates were recorded, their data feeds were established, and teams of personnel were dispatched to install and maintain the equipment. What the official record does not explain, what cannot be explained by radiation monitoring alone, is why the coordinates of those specific stations cluster so precisely around the Hopi mesas. A researcher named Sandra Kellerman, working independently in the early 1990s on a Freedom of Information Act project related to Cold War environmental monitoring, noticed the cluster pattern and submitted a formal inquiry. She was told the placement was determined by prevailing wind modelling from the Nevada test site. The explanation was technically plausible. It was also, as Kellerman later noted in a paper that was quietly declined by 3 separate academic journals before being published in a small independent newsletter, mathematically inconsistent with the wind modelling data that had been declassified from the same period. The stations were not placed to monitor where the wind went. They were placed to monitor specific geographic zones that appeared again and again in the Hopi prophetic traditions as sites of cosmic significance. And the data those stations collected was not consistent with simple radiation monitoring. The instruments were recording 2 things that had no immediate explanation. First, subsurface vibration anomalies. Low-frequency seismic activity occurring at irregular intervals, too shallow to be tectonic movement of the type common in the region, too deep to be surface disturbance from weather or human activity. Second, magnetic fluctuations unlike anything observed in the surrounding desert geology. The Colorado Plateau has a distinctive magnetic signature. These readings were deviating from that signature in ways that the personnel who processed the data flagged repeatedly for additional review. The program was given an internal code name. The name was later said to refer to solar radiation tracking. But the files that were eventually found, in a server room that was not supposed to exist anymore, told a different story. The document is a single internal memorandum, 12 pages, typed on a government-issue typewriter, with certain passages underlined in red ink that suggests a senior reviewer went through it carefully. The date is listed as March of 1957, and the classification marking at the top reads in a designation that, when cross-referenced with intelligence community classification systems of the period, corresponds to a level above top secret. The memorandum was produced by an analytical unit whose formal title has never been publicly identified. The authors referred to their work internally as a comparative symbolic analysis. What they had done, over the course of several years, was systematically cross-reference documented Hopi prophecy symbolism with observable events in post-war American and global technological development. The results of that cross-reference were, by any conservative academic standard, remarkable. The prophecies described, in language preserved across generations, a series of developments that would signal the final phase of the Fourth World. And when the analysts laid those descriptions next to the technological trajectory of the mid-20th century, the alignment was not vague. It was not the kind of a loose metaphorical connection that can be retrofitted onto almost any event. It was, in the language of the memorandum itself, statistically improbable as coincidence. The first comparison involved what the prophecies described as a great spider web stretched across the land, connecting distant places and carrying voices and thoughts instantaneously from one end of the world to the other. The analysts noted the obvious correspondence to the telecommunications infrastructure that had been expanding across North America since the late 19th century, and had, by the 1950s, created precisely the kind of interconnected communication grid that the metaphor described. The second comparison involved the prophecy's warning of gourds of ashes that would fall from the sky and destroy great areas of land, poisoning the earth and the water for generations. The analysts noted the direct correspondence to nuclear fallout, including the specific detail about multi-generational contamination that was consistent with what scientists had learned about radioactive isotope persistence since 1945. The third comparison involved a description of a house in the sky that would move among the stars, carrying human beings beyond the atmosphere of the Earth. The analysts noted that, at the time the memorandum was written in 1957, Sputnik had been launched into orbit just months earlier. The memorandum concluded with a sentence that was underlined twice by whoever reviewed it. Prophecy descriptions demonstrate statistically significant alignment with post-industrial technological developments. Recommend continued monitoring and expanded cultural intelligence collection. Classification to remain at current level pending further analysis. It was filed, it was reviewed, and the program quietly expanded its mandate. By the early 1960s, the United States was engaged in the most intensive period of nuclear weapons development in its history. Underground tests at the Nevada test site were occurring with a frequency that created a near-constant low-level seismic tremor across the Great Basin. Above-ground tests in the Pacific sent radioactive clouds drifting eastward. The Earth itself was being subjected to energies and pressures that had not existed in geological memory. On the Hopi mesas, the elders were conducting ceremonies that outsiders rarely witnessed. These ceremonies were not theatrical performances. They were, in the Hopi understanding, functional. They were acts of spiritual maintenance, practical work performed to sustain the relationship between human beings and the living earth. And in this period, the ceremonies carried an urgency that long-time observers noted was unusual. The elders were describing an imbalance, not a future imbalance, a present one, an active disruption in the relationship between human technological activity and the geological and cosmic systems that the Hopi cosmology understood as interconnected. Simultaneously, something was happening underground. The Department of Defense, working through front contracts with civilian geological survey companies, had installed a network of remote seismic monitoring stations across northeastern Arizona, southern Utah, and northwestern New Mexico, the Four Corners region. The network was described in its administrative documents as a National Seismic Safety Research Program. The data it was collecting told a different story. Beginning in approximately 1962, and continuing through the decade, the monitoring stations were recording repeated low-frequency pulses originating from deep beneath the Colorado Plateau. Deep, far deeper than the surface vibrations that Nevada test site detonations could explain. These pulses had a periodicity, a regularity, that was inconsistent with the random, irregular pattern of seismic activity caused by nuclear tests or tectonic movement. They were rhythmic. The technicians who processed the data flagged the anomaly in every quarterly report. Senior analysts reviewed those flags. The data was transmitted to a specialized unit that did not appear on any published organizational chart of the Department of Defense. And in classified internal communications from this period, a phrase appears for the first time that would reappear in documents across the next 3 decades: pre-transition activity. No one in the unclassified record has ever defined what transition was being referenced. Among the many elements of Hopi prophetic tradition, one stands out as both the most dramatic and the most specific. It is the prediction of the blue star Kachina. In the Hopi ceremonial calendar, Kachinas are spiritual entities that embody the forces of nature, the spirits of the ancestors, and the cosmic principles that govern life on Earth. There are hundreds of Kachinas in the Hopi tradition, each with specific characteristics, specific appearances, and specific roles in the ceremonial and cosmic order. The blue star Kachina is different. It is not a figure of the established ceremonial order, it is a prophetic figure. one that appears not in regular ceremony but in prophecy. And the prophecy is specific. At some point during the final phase of the Fourth World, a blue star will appear in the sky. Its appearance will mark a critical threshold in the transition between worlds. In the late 1960s, a small unit within the Air Force's Astronomical Monitoring Division began tracking something unusual. The unit had access to optical and radio telescope data from a network of observatories that had been collecting information since the early years of the space program. In reviewing that data, analysts identified periodic reports of an unusual celestial object, not a known comet, not a classified satellite, not any catalogued body in the conventional astronomical record, that appeared to be following an irregular orbital path through the inner solar system. The object had a distinctive spectral signature. Under certain observational conditions, at certain points in its orbit, it emitted light in the blue-violet range of the visible spectrum. The unit began a quiet, informal program of tracking this object. They gave it a nickname that they used only in the internal communications, never in formal reports. They called it Blue Star Watch. Formal astronomical designation was never assigned in any document that has entered the public record. The program continued for years, quietly, carefully, with observations logged in a restricted access database that was maintained separately from the standard astronomical catalogues that circulated among civilian scientists. And every time the object completed a pass through the inner solar system, appearing briefly as a faint blue-tinted light in the night sky, before disappearing back into the outer reaches of the solar neighbourhood, the restricted database was updated, and the classified file cross-referenced with the Hopi prophecy archive was updated as well. The date was December 10th, 1992. The venue was the United Nations General Assembly Hall in New York City. The occasion was the International Year of the World's Indigenous People. An elderly Hopi man named Thomas Banyasia stood at the podium and delivered a speech that, by any objective account of its content, should have been the most widely discussed address of that decade. Banyasia had been designated by Hopi traditional leaders in 1948, at almost the exact same time that Frank Waters was conducting his interviews near Oribe, as an official messenger to the outside world. His mandate was specific: to deliver the Hopi warning to the leaders of the nations of the world, particularly to what the elders called the House of Mika, the structure they believed had been built specifically to receive that warning. The House of Mika was the United Nations building in New York City. The elders had described it in prophetic terms generations before it was constructed, referring to a great house with walls like glass and crystal that would be built on the eastern shore of the continent, where the representatives of all the world's nations would gather to discuss the fate of humanity. Banyasia had tried to deliver the message to the United Nations for over 40 years. He had been refused, delayed, and redirected by bureaucratic processes that he navigated with the patience of a man who understood long-time horizons. He finally addressed the General Assembly in 1992, at the age of 86. His speech was measured, careful, specific. He described the Hopi understanding of the cycles of worlds. He described the signs that had been observed. He described the trajectory he believed humanity was on. He asked the nations of the world to change their relationship with the earth before a change was imposed upon them by forces larger than any government could manage. He was followed in the formal program by another speaker. The hall moved on. But what the formal diplomatic record does not reflect, what appears only in cables and memoranda that were classified at the national security level, is the level of institutional attention that Banyasia's address received from intelligence agencies. Analysts from multiple organisations were present in the General Assembly Hall on December 10th, 1992. Not in official capacities, not with credentials that identified their institutional affiliations, but present, with observers' access, listening and taking notes. The briefing document prepared in the weeks following the speech was labelled Indigenous Predictive Framework Analysis. It was not filed in a cultural studies archive. It was filed with the collection that had been growing quietly since September of 1945. By the late 1990s, The science of climate modelling had advanced to the point where long-range projections were becoming both technically feasible and institutionally important. Agencies across the federal government were running models. The scenarios varied, the parameters differed, but the trajectory that emerged from model after model was consistent enough to prompt serious internal discussion about what the long-term environmental future of the planet might look like. A team of climate scientists working within a federal research program made an unexpected discovery in the course of their modelling work. They had been given access, under a classified research directive, to the cultural intelligence archive that had been accumulating since the 1940s. The access was framed as a methodology experiment. Could traditional ecological knowledge contained in indigenous oral traditions provide useful baseline data for long-range environmental modelling? The team was sceptical, professionally sceptical, in the way that scientists trained in quantitative methods tend to be when asked to engage with material that lacks the methodological rigour of peer-reviewed research. The scepticism lasted approximately 3 weeks into the analysis. What the team found when they mapped the Hopi prophetic timeline against the long-range climate projections they had developed independently was not a loose correlation. It was not the kind of ambiguous overlap that could be dismissed as confirmation bias. The Hopi symbolic timeline, as documented in the Cultural Intelligence Archive, described a series of environmental and social developments that corresponded with striking precision to the projected tipping points their own models had identified for the period between approximately 2000 and 2050. The internal memorandum summarising the finding used careful, measured scientific language. It avoided any framing that would invite accusations of mysticism or credulous interpretation. It proposed a specific alternative hypothesis. The Hopi prophecies were not supernatural predictions. They were cultural memory. They were the preserved observational record of a civilization that had lived through previous periods of catastrophic environmental and social instability, not in legend, but in reality, and had encoded the pattern of that instability in narrative form precise enough to survive thousands of years of oral transmission. The civilizations that had lived through the previous cycles had understood what was coming. They had tried to communicate the pattern forward across time, and they had succeeded well enough that analysts working with 21st century computational tools were now reading the pattern and finding it accurate. The memorandum was classified, it was added to the archive, and the archive's classification level was upgraded. His name, or at least the name he used in the independent security research community, was Lucas Hale. He was 29 years old in 2006, working freelance contract cybersecurity work for small technology firms, while pursuing the kind of independent research that occupied the grey areas between legitimate penetration testing and the informal culture of internet archaeology that had become a significant subculture in the early years of the 21st century. He was not a political person. He was not motivated by ideology or by a specific grievance against any institution. He was motivated by the thing that drives a particular category of technically gifted, intellectually restless individuals, the conviction that interesting things exist in places where you're not supposed to look. He had been working for several months on a project that had begun almost accidentally. A Department of Energy server address had appeared in a dataset he was analysing for a client, and when he investigated the address, he discovered that it corresponded to a physical machine that the Department of Energy's network documentation listed as decommissioned in 2001. Decommissioned systems are supposed to be wiped, physically disconnected and rendered inaccessible. This one was not. It was still connected, it was still running, and its access credentials had not been rotated since before its supposed decommissioning. Lucas Hale spent 3 weeks carefully, methodically working his way into the system. He was not reckless. He documented every step. He maintained extensive logs. He was, by his own account in later communications shared with a small group of trusted contacts, deeply uncertain about whether he should be doing what he was doing, but he kept going. The server contained a directory structure that was largely empty. Years of routine file operations producing an archaeological record of what had once been stored there, and subsequently removed. But not everything had been removed. In the directory structure, nested several levels below the root in a path that suggested it had been placed there deliberately by someone who wanted it to survive routine cleanup sweeps, was a folder. The folder was named Fifth World Transition. Inside the folder were 412 files. Some were text documents. Some were data files with formats that required specialised software to read. Some were image scans of what appeared to be physical documents. Pages of typed text, handwritten margin notes, government letterhead with classification markings at the top and bottom of every page. Lucas Hale began reading. He read for 3 days straight, stopping only to sleep in short intervals and to eat whatever was within reach of his workspace. By the end of the 3rd day, he had a preliminary understanding of what he was looking at, and he understood why it had been buried. Among the 412 files in the folder, one document stood apart from the others. Not because of its length. It was actually one of the shorter documents in the collection, running to just under 20 pages of typed text. Not because of its date, though the date, April 17th, 1971, was significant. It stood apart because of what it was. The other documents in the folder were analytical. They were reports, memoranda, data summaries, academic-style analyses. They were the products of observation and interpretation. They described. This document prescribed. Its title, typed in capitals across the top of the first page beneath a classification marking that Lucas Hale recognised from his research as a designation reserved for material with national security implications at the highest level, was the World Transition Contingency Plan. The document had 4 primary objectives, stated explicitly in the opening section. Objective 1. Preserve governmental continuity through a potential period of significant social disruption, resulting from environmental, geological or cosmic events, consistent with the timeline identified in the Cultural Intelligence Archive. Objective 2. Identify and protect the geographic locations designated as significant in the indigenous prophetic traditions that had been under study, on the hypothesis that these locations might represent areas of geological or ecological stability during transition events. Objective 3. Prevent public panic that might result from widespread knowledge of the prophetic timeline and its correspondence to observable developments. Objective 4. Maintain ongoing monitoring of all identified variables, astronomical, geological, biological, social, to provide maximum lead time for governmental response to transition event initiation. The document was bureaucratic in its language. It was measured. It was written in the style of professionals trained to approach extraordinary situations with procedural normalcy. But the implication beneath the language was impossible to misread. The people who wrote this document believed that a transition event was real. They believed it was coming. They believed they understood, at least partially, what it would involve. And they had spent the better part of a decade building a planning framework for surviving it. Lucas Hale sat back from his screen. He had been a skeptic about most things his entire life. It was, professionally and temperamentally, his default mode. But sitting in his apartment in the early hours of a morning in 2006, reading a classified government contingency plan for the transition between world cycles, described in an ancient indigenous prophecy, he found that his skepticism had nowhere to go. The document was real, the archive was real, and the people who had compiled it were not mystics or cranks. They were career government analysts, military planners, climate scientists. They were, by every professional measure, exactly the kind of people whose assessments you would trust. They had looked at the evidence, and they had concluded that it was worth planning for. In Hopi cosmology, the transition between worlds does not happen abstractly. It happens through a specific geographic feature. The Sipapu, the emergence point, is the physical location through which the survivors of the previous world emerged into the current one, and through which the transition to the next world will be initiated. The Hopi locate the Sipapu in the Grand Canyon near the confluence of the Colorado River and the Little Colorado River. The specific location is sacred. It is not a tourist attraction. It is not publicly accessible. It is a place that Hopi traditional leaders have maintained as a ceremonial site for as long as their oral tradition records. When Lucas Hale began mapping the geographic data contained in the folder against publicly available records of federal land restrictions and protected zones, he expected to find some overlap. He expected the monitoring program to have focused on the areas around the Hopi mesas themselves, which were the most obvious locations documented in the Cultural Intelligence Archive. What he found instead was a pattern that he described to his contacts as the most clarifying thing he had encountered in 3 days of reading classified documents. The federal land restrictions, some established through standard national park and monument designations, some through military exclusion zones, some through a category of restricted area that does not appear in any public land management registry, formed a ring. A complete ring, if you traced it on a map, around the Hopi mesas and the Colorado Plateau region. The ring was not uniform. It had gaps. It had areas where the restrictions were lighter and areas where the restrictions were absolute. But as a geographic pattern, it was unmistakable. And the centre of the ring, the point equidistant from the restricted zones on all sides, corresponded almost exactly to the location of the Sipapu. There was more. In the satellite data that had been included in the archive, data from geological survey satellites that had been imaging the Colorado Plateau since the early days of the space program, there were readings that the standard geological explanations did not fully account for. Deep beneath the Colorado Plateau, seismic imaging had revealed what the technical reports described as an anomalous chamber structure, not a cave system, not a natural geological void of the kind that the karst topography of the region commonly produced. Something deeper, something with geometric regularities that natural geological processes do not typically produce. The government geologists who had written the technical reports had not attributed the anomaly to supernatural causes. They had proposed several conventional explanations and noted that none of them fully accounted for the data. They had also noted in a single sentence at the end of one report that the location of the anomaly corresponded to the geographic coordinates of the Sipapu as documented in the Cultural Intelligence Archive. They had not drawn a conclusion from that correspondence, but they had noted it. On a Tuesday morning in the late summer of 2008, monitoring stations across northern Arizona and southern Utah recorded a sequence of events that lasted approximately 14 minutes. The sequence began with a sudden, sharp increase in localized magnetic field intensity across a zone of approximately 80 miles in diameter, centered on the Colorado Plateau. The increase was not gradual. It was not the kind of slow variation that magnetic monitoring stations typically recorded over hours or days. It was sudden, a jump in the data from baseline readings to elevated readings that occurred within a single measurement interval. Simultaneously, instruments measuring atmospheric ionization, the density of electrically charged particles in the air, recorded a spike across the same geographic zone. The spike was brief. It lasted less than 3 minutes by the time it was captured across the full network of monitoring stations. But its intensity was, in the words of the technical report that was later produced, outside the range of any previously recorded natural ionization event in the region. And for a period of approximately 11 minutes during the peak of the magnetic and ionization anomaly, communication systems across northern Arizona experienced interruptions. Radio signals were affected. Cellular networks experienced outages in areas where infrastructure was functioning normally before and after. The official explanation, released in a brief public notice issued by the Federal Aviation Administration because aviation communications had been briefly affected, was solar interference, a geomagnetic disturbance associated with solar activity. The explanation was plausible. Solar weather events do cause exactly the kinds of effects that were recorded on that Tuesday morning. What the public explanation did not address, what the restricted internal memorandum produced by the monitoring network's senior analysts addressed directly, was the geographic specificity of the event. Solar weather events affect large areas. They affect hemispheric regions. They do not typically produce effects concentrated in an 80-mile diameter circle, centered on a specific location in the American Southwest. The internal memorandum used a specific phrase in its concluding assessment: event characteristics consistent with pre-transition fluctuation. Recommend elevated monitoring posture and cross-reference with Blue Star Watch astronomical data. By the time Lucas Hale had worked his way through the later documents in the archive, the ones produced in the 1990s and 2000s, after the climate modelling findings and the continued accumulation of geological, astronomical and social data, he had encountered a shift in the way the analysts framed their conclusions. In the early documents, from the 1940s through the 1960s, the framing was cautious. The prophecies were treated as a data source of uncertain reliability that might contain useful information. The analysts were careful to maintain professional distance from the content, noting correlations without asserting causation, flagging anomalies without proposing mechanisms. But in the later documents, that distance had narrowed. The analysts had arrived, through decades of accumulated evidence, at a position that was carefully stated but unmistakable in its implications. They no longer believed the Hopi prophecies were describing destruction in the catastrophic civilizational collapse sense that the word apocalypse typically implies. The word that appeared with increasing frequency in the later documents was transition. The fifth world in the analyst's revised framework was not a world after annihilation. It was a world after a threshold. The first interpretation the analysts explored was environmental, a major global environmental reset, a period of rapid ecological change severe enough to fundamentally alter the conditions of human civilization as it currently exists, followed by a stabilization into a different kind of equilibrium. The second interpretation was cosmological, a solar cycle instability event of a type that has occurred multiple times in the geological record, producing a combination of climatic, magnetic and atmospheric effects that would be, by modern civilizational standards, catastrophic in their disruption, but not in their permanence. The third interpretation was geological, a planetary magnetic shift, a reversal or excursion of the Earth's magnetic field, which the geological record confirmed had occurred multiple times in the planet's history, and which would, if it occurred in the modern era, affect every electronic, navigational and communication system on the planet, while also producing biological effects that were poorly understood. The fourth interpretation was the one that the analysts approached most carefully, and that several of them explicitly declined to address in formal documents, noting that it fell outside their analytical remit. It was the possibility that the transition the Hopi prophecy described was not primarily physical, that it was, in some sense, that the analytical frameworks available to government researchers were not equipped to evaluate a transition in human consciousness itself, a shift in the fundamental relationship between human awareness and the world it inhabits. The analysts who raised this possibility and then declined to pursue it were not mystics. They were professionals who had spent years immersed in data that kept pointing in a direction their training told them could not be the correct direction. But the data kept pointing there, so they noted it, they flagged it, they declined to conclude, and they kept monitoring. Across the years of Blue Star Watch observations, the astronomical unit had accumulated data spanning decades. They had tracked the object's appearances in the inner solar system. They had measured its orbital characteristics as precisely as the observational tools available to them allowed, and they had, over time, constructed a model of its behaviour that allowed them to make projections. The projections were not precise in the way that standard astronomical calculations of known orbital bodies are precise. The object's path was irregular in ways that suggested it was subject to gravitational influences that the model did not fully account for. But the broad strokes of its orbital cycle were clear enough to estimate. The object returned to the inner solar system on a long cycle. The analysts estimated the cycle at between 3,000 and 4,000 years, with significant uncertainty in both directions. But across the decades of observation they had accumulated, they were confident in one thing: the object was returning. Its most recent observable appearance had placed it at the far edge of detectable range. The next closest approach, based on the best available orbital modelling, was projected to occur somewhere in the mid-21st century, The document in the archive that recorded this projection was dated 2002, and at the end of the technical summary there was a note, informal, clearly added after the main analysis was complete, that read simply, "The blue star Kachina approaches. Time uncertain. Direction confirmed." At the bottom of the directory, after the cultural intelligence reports and the satellite observation logs, and the restricted anthropology transcripts and the climate modelling memoranda and the contingency planning documents, Lucas Hale found a single file that was different from all the others. It was encrypted, not with the standard encryption protocols that the other restricted documents used. This file used a different protocol, a more recent one that suggested it had been encrypted or re-encrypted long after the other files in the archive were created. It took Lucas Hale 11 days to open it. He was by that point aware that he had been spending more time than was wise on a system he had no legal right to access. He was also aware that the material he had found was not the kind of thing that could be simply dismissed or ignored. He was in the position of the person who, having opened a door they were not supposed to open, cannot pretend they did not see what was on the other side. The final file was a briefing document. It was the most recently dated document in the entire archive, listed as prepared in 1998, though it referenced material from the full span of the archive's history, suggesting it had been written as a comprehensive summary rather than a contemporaneous record. Its subject was the fundamental question that the archive had been circling for 50 years without directly stating. The question was, what does it mean that an ancient indigenous culture accurately described developments that took place centuries or millennia after the traditions were established? The analyst's final answer, their considered, carefully constructed, professionally responsible answer, occupied 3 paragraphs of the briefing document. Lucas Hale read them several times. The first paragraph noted that the accumulated evidence did not support a supernatural explanation, and that the analytical team was not proposing one. The second paragraph proposed the alternative that the climate modelling team had suggested years earlier, now expanded and supported by the full weight of the archive's accumulated findings, that indigenous knowledge systems like the Hopi tradition represented preserved observational science of extraordinary depth, developed by civilizations that had experienced and survived previous cycles of catastrophic change, and had encoded the pattern of those cycles in narrative and ceremonial form precise enough to survive thousands of years of oral transmission. The third paragraph was the one that stopped Lucas Hale. It read, in its entirety, as follows. The most significant implication of the evidence reviewed in this analysis is not that the Hopi prophetic tradition accurately describes future events. It is that in order to do so with the precision documented in this archive, the tradition must have preserved observational records from prior civilizational cycles that modern science has not yet identified. The conclusion, if the evidence is accepted, is that the cycle described in the Fourth World to Fifth World transition framework has occurred before. That human civilization, or something that can reasonably be called human civilization, survived it before, and that the survival of whatever comes next was the purpose for which the knowledge was preserved. Lucas Hale closed his laptop. He sat in his apartment in the dark for a long time. Then he made copies of everything, distributed them across locations he trusted, and began to plan a trip to Arizona. He drove through the night, Highway 89 through the Navajo Nation, the land opening up around him into the vast, dark, empty expanse of the Colorado Plateau. The sky above was extraordinary. No light pollution for 100 miles in any direction. The stars so dense and so present that they felt close enough to touch. He had not told anyone where he was going. He was not sure what he expected to find. He had spent weeks reading documents that described this landscape in the language of geological anomaly and classified monitoring programs and prophetic significance. He wanted to see it as what it actually was. He arrived at the base of the Hopi mesas before the sun came up. He parked on the shoulder of the state highway and got out of the car. The air was cold and dry and absolutely still. The mesas rose above him, dark against the pre-dawn sky, massive and ancient and profoundly indifferent to the concerns of any individual human being. He had been told by someone in his network who had spent time in the region that the dawn ceremony, if one was being performed, would begin when the first light appeared on the eastern horizon. He was not invited to the ceremony. He was not on Hopi land. He was standing on the highway at the base of the mesa, which was as close as he was going to get, and that was fine. He watched the horizon begin to lighten. Slowly at first, the faintest suggestion of grey in the east, barely distinguishable from the darkness. Then the grey deepened and spread, and the stars at the eastern edge of the sky began to fade, and the shapes of the mesas became clearer, and the desert floor around him began to emerge from the darkness in shades of rust and ochre and pale sand. Somewhere above him, on the mesa, the ceremony was happening. He could not see it. He could not hear it. But he knew it was happening because it had been happening at every dawn ceremony since before his great-grandmother's great-grandmother was born, and there was no reason to believe it was not happening now. The sun broke the horizon. It came up fast, the way it does in the desert, without the soft diffusion of humidity that makes sunrise gradual in other places. One moment the horizon was dark. The next moment the top edge of the sun was there, fierce and immediate, and the whole landscape flooded with warm gold light, and the shadows of the mesas stretched westward across the desert floor like long dark fingers pointing towards something. Lucas Hale stood on the highway shoulder and watched the sunrise. He thought about the files, about the analysts who had spent their careers trying to understand what they were looking at, about the elders who had carried the knowledge forward across centuries and millennia, about the specific, precise, improbable accuracy of what had been preserved and what had been found. He thought about the word transition, not destruction, not apocalypse, not the end of everything. Transition, the movement from one state to another, the crossing of a threshold that exists not because someone built it there, but because the natural cycles of the earth and the cosmos and the patterns of human civilization make it inevitable. Not a punishment, not a judgment, just the next thing. The sun continued to rise. The desert got warmer. Birds appeared, calling to each other across the scrub. Lucas Hale got back in his car. He had a long drive ahead of him. The archive, if it exists, and the evidence suggests it does, represents one of the more extraordinary examples of what intelligence agencies call long-term pattern analysis. Decades of work by serious credentialed professionals following a thread of evidence wherever it led. What they found, by the end, was not what they expected to find when the first flagged report landed on a government desk in September of 1945. They expected at most to document a cultural curiosity that might have marginal intelligence value. They found instead something that resisted every conventional explanatory framework they brought to it. The Hopi people had preserved, across an unbroken chain of oral transmission, spanning a duration that modern historians prefer not to estimate too precisely, a detailed and accurate account of a pattern that the most sophisticated analytical tools available to the most powerful government on earth were still struggling to fully understand. They had not preserved it for the government. They had not preserved it for researchers or analysts or independent cybersecurity professionals who stumbled across abandoned servers. They had preserved it for the same reason they had always preserved it, because they understood, in a way that modern civilization is still learning to understand, that the pattern matters more than any individual cycle within the pattern. The fourth world is ending. It has been ending, if the Hopi framework is correct, since at least 1945, when the fire that awakened what sleeps beneath was released into the world for the first time. The fifth world will begin. Not with catastrophe, not with spectacle, not with any single dramatic event that can be pointed to and said, there, that is the moment, with recognition. The recognition that the knowledge was always there, that the warning was given, that the pattern was preserved, and that the people who carried it forward across mountains of time, across cycles of civilization that left no trace in any textbook, across the long silence of centuries during which the people who held the knowledge were dismissed and marginalized and overlooked, those people were right. They were always right. and somewhere on a high desert mesa in northern Arizona, as the sun rises over the same landscape it has risen over, for longer than any living memory can reach, a ceremony continues, as it always has, as it always will, until the transition is complete, until the fifth world begins. There is one more thread worth following before we close: the solar micronova hypothesis, developed by independent researchers working outside mainstream academic institutions and drawing on a growing body of geological and ice core evidence, proposes that the Sun undergoes periodic episodes of elevated energetic output that are orders of magnitude more intense than the solar activity measured in modern observational records. These episodes, according to the hypothesis, occur on cycles of approximately 12,000 years. They produce in a compressed time frame the kind of climatic, magnetic and atmospheric disruption that the geological record shows occurring repeatedly across the Pleistocene and Holocene epochs. They are consistent with the flood myths, the skyfire narratives, and the civilization-ending events that appear in oral traditions on every continent. The Hopi framework of world cycles, each ending in a different kind of catastrophe, maps with reasonable precision onto the kinds of events a solar micronova would produce. The first world ending in fire could describe a period of intense solar energetic output. The second world ending in ice could describe the rapid cooling that would follow the disruption of ocean circulation systems in the aftermath of a major solar event. The third world ending in water could describe the coastal inundation that would follow the rapid melting of ice sheets destabilized by a combination of solar heating and magnetic disturbance. The analysts who worked on the archive do not appear to have had access to the specific solar micronova research, which was not developed until decades after the early classified work was done. But the climate modelling documents from the late 1990s discuss solar cycle instability in terms that, read in the context of what has since been proposed, suggest the researchers were approaching the same territory from a different direction. The thread, if followed, leads to the same place the Hopi prophecy leads: a cycle, a threshold, a transition, and a question that no current scientific or governmental framework has fully answered. Is the current period of global environmental instability a consequence of human industrial activity alone, or is it also being driven by something larger, something that operates on timescales that dwarf the entire recorded history of human civilization? And perhaps most striking of all is this: the Hopi prophecy is not alone. The pattern it describes, world cycles, a current world nearing its end, signs of transition in the natural and human world, a coming period of disruption followed by a new phase of existence, appears in the traditional knowledge systems of cultures on every continent. The Maya long count calendar describes a similar cyclical framework. The Hindu tradition describes 4 world ages called yugas, each with specific characteristics and each followed by the next. The current age is described as the most materially focused and spiritually attenuated of the 4, and its conclusion is described in terms that correspond, in broad strokes, to the kinds of events the archive documents. Norse mythology describes Ragnarok not simply as a battle of gods, but as a cosmic reset followed by a new world emerging from the ocean, green and renewed, populated by survivors who had preserved the seeds of knowledge and culture through the transition. Aboriginal Australian traditions describe the Dreamtime not as a historical past, but as a living framework through which the patterns of existence, including transitions between phases, can be accessed and understood. These traditions, developed independently in widely separated cultures, might represent independent observations of the same underlying pattern. If the pattern is real, if the cycle of world transitions is a genuine feature of the relationship between human civilization, planetary dynamics, and astronomical cycles, then multiple cultures might have observed it, each through their own frameworks of understanding, each encoding it in their own cultural language. What would that mean? It would mean that the warning is not just Hopi. It is universal. It has been given in every language spoken by human beings, in every culture that survived long enough to develop the frameworks necessary to recognize the pattern. And it has been given specifically to us, to the civilization that currently occupies the fourth world, to the people listening to these words in the particular way that people in this particular historical moment listen to things. The warning has been given. Whether it is heard is, and always has been, the only question that matters. Good night, wherever in the world you are listening from. Sleep well, and remember, the knowledge was always there. There is something else worth considering, something the analysts touched on but never fully explored in the documents Lucas Hale recovered. The question of who built the archive in the first place, and more precisely, who made the decision that it needed to be built at all. Every bureaucratic structure has an origin point. Every classified program began with a specific request, a specific authorization, a specific individual or group of individuals who decided that resources should be directed toward a particular problem. The Cultural Intelligence Archive that became the Fifth World Collection did not grow organically. It was not the result of independent researchers working in parallel, accidentally arriving at the same conclusions and eventually connecting their findings. It was a directed program. Someone at some point in the years immediately following the Trinity test made a deliberate decision that the Hopi prophetic tradition was worth investigating at a classified level, that the resources of military intelligence should be applied to the study of an indigenous cosmological framework, that this work should be conducted quietly, outside the normal channels of academic or governmental transparency, and that its findings should be restricted to an audience that could not include the general public. That decision was not the kind of decision that gets made casually, not in the bureaucratic culture of mid-20th century American intelligence. Such a decision required justification. It required someone to make a case, in language that would be persuasive to the kind of skeptical, pragmatic military and intelligence officials who controlled resources in that environment. It required someone to explain why this particular body of indigenous tradition, among all the indigenous traditions that existed across the continent, deserved classified analytical attention. The September 1945 report from the Bureau of Indian Affairs may have been the trigger. But triggers alone do not create programs. Triggers create attention. Programs require sustained institutional will. And somewhere in the gap between the September report and the fully operational monitoring network that was in place by the early 1950s, something happened. Some conversation was had. Some briefing was given. Some assessment was made by people with the authority to commit resources. That conversation, that briefing, that assessment, none of it has ever entered the public record. The earliest document in the Fifth World Archive that Lucas Hale found was dated 1952. The 7 years between September 1945 and 1952 represent a gap in the record that may simply reflect the fact that earlier documents were not preserved in the particular server that Hale accessed. Or it may reflect something else, the deliberate removal of the earliest, most sensitive material from a collection that was already highly classified. The question of what was in those missing 7 years, what conversations happened, what decisions were made, what evidence prompted the commitment of resources, may never be answered. But the fact that the program existed at all is itself the answer to the most fundamental question. Someone in a position of institutional authority, in the years immediately following the first use of nuclear weapons, took the Hopi prophecy seriously enough to build a classified monitoring program around it, not a study group, not an academic grant, a classified monitoring program with field stations and satellite data and interdisciplinary analytical teams and a physical infrastructure that persisted, in one form or another, for more than 50 years. That is not what you do with something you dismiss. That is what you do with something you believe might be real. The Hopi word for the emergence point between worlds is also used in everyday language to refer to the navel, the physical location on the human body that marks the point of original connection, the place where the cord of life was attached. The analogy is not accidental. In Hopi cosmology, the Sipapu is the navel of the world, in the same way that the human navel is the mark of original emergence. It is the place where the world was fed, where it was sustained, where it was connected to something larger and older than itself, and it is the place through which the next phase of existence will be born. The Hopi do not describe the transition between worlds as death. They describe it as birth. The fourth world does not end the way a flame is extinguished, suddenly, completely, with nothing remaining. It ends the way one stage of development ends and another begins, the way an egg opens, the way a seed cracks. The world that emerges is not the world that preceded it, but it is not unconnected to it either. It carries forward what was preserved. It begins with the knowledge that the people who survived chose to bring through the passage. This is what the government analysts ultimately concluded in the careful language of the final briefing document. Not that the world was ending, not that civilization was doomed, but that a threshold existed, and that the Hopi had been describing that threshold for generations, and that the threshold was approaching, and that the question of what came through it, what knowledge, what values, what understanding of the relationship between human beings and the world they inhabit, was the most important question any civilization had ever faced. They were bureaucrats, they were analysts, they were people trained to process information and produce assessments and file reports and attend meetings and move up the institutional hierarchies of the organizations they served. They were not philosophers or spiritual leaders or visionaries, and yet, at the end of 50 years of patient, classified, quietly extraordinary work, they had arrived at the same place that the Hopi elders had been standing all along. The transition is not something that happens to you. It is something you participate in. The choice of what to bring through, what to preserve, what to protect, what to hold on to as everything familiar becomes unfamiliar. That choice belongs to the people living in the final years of the Fourth World. To every person who has ever heard this story and felt, somewhere beneath the skepticism that modern life instills in all of us, that it resonated with something they already knew, something older than memory, something that has been trying, across all the centuries of human civilization, to be remembered. The Hopi have a phrase that translates roughly as walking the road of life with proper attention. It means something specific in the context of their cosmology. It means understanding that you're not simply an individual navigating a personal existence. You are a link in a chain that extends backward through the previous worlds and forward into the next one. What you do with your portion of the pattern matters, not in the grandiose sense of history-making or world-changing, in the quiet, daily cumulative sense of whether the knowledge you carry is honoured or abandoned, whether the warnings you have been given are heard or dismissed, whether the thread of continuity that has been maintained against extraordinary odds across cycles of civilization that left no other trace in any record that modern humanity can access is held or dropped. Lucas Hale drove back through the Navajo Nation as the morning heated up around him. The red rocks, the blue sky, the immense, indifferent, beautiful emptiness of the Colorado Plateau stretching to every horizon. He did not know what he was going to do with the files. He did not know whether the story he had stumbled into was one that the world was ready to hear. He did not know whether the transition was decades away or years away or already, in ways that he could not yet perceive, underway. What he knew was simpler than any of those questions. He knew that the knowledge existed, that it had been preserved, that people had dedicated their lives, the Hopi elders across generations, the government analysts across decades, and now, in some small way that he was still processing himself, to ensuring that the pattern was not forgotten, that the warning was not lost. He stopped at a gas station on the edge of the Navajo Nation and bought a coffee and stood outside in the morning sun, leaning against his car, looking north toward the mesas. They were visible from there, dark shapes on the horizon, rising above the flat desert floor, ancient, permanent, patient in a way that no human lifetime could fully comprehend. He thought about the September 1945 report. The anthropologist who wrote it had almost certainly never imagined that their fieldwork note would end up classified and filed in a military intelligence archive. They had been doing their job, recording what they saw, trying to understand what they were witnessing. The elders who stopped the interviews had done the same. They had made a decision about what to share and what to withhold, based on their own assessment of what was happening in the world and what that meant for the knowledge they carried. Every person in the chain had done what they believed was right with what they had been given. That was all any of them could do. That was all any of us can do. In the fourth world or the fifth, in the time before the threshold or after it, the job is the same. Pay attention, carry what matters, hold the thread. The coffee was bad, the morning was beautiful. The mesas stood on the horizon as they had stood for 1,000 years, and would stand for 1,000 more, regardless of what any government classified or any researcher found, or any individual understood or failed to understand about the pattern that contained them all. Lucas Hale finished his coffee, got back in his car and drove toward the rising sun. Somewhere on those mesas, without announcement, without spectacle, without any of the drama that human beings tend to attach to moments of significance, the ceremony continued, as it always had, as those who carried the knowledge forward across the long dark passage between worlds intended it would. Quiet, persistent, exact. The warning was given, it is still being given, and whether the fifth world begins with recognition, or with whatever comes when recognition fails, that, the Hopi have always said, depends entirely on us. There is a specific detail about the Blue Star Watch program that deserves more attention than it received in the documents Lucas Hale found. The analysts who maintained the restricted astronomical database were not professional astronomers in the academic sense. They were intelligence analysts with specialised training in pattern recognition and data interpretation. They had been given access to telescope networks not because they were equipped to conduct original astronomical research, but because they were equipped to evaluate what they were seeing in the context of the broader archive they were managing. This distinction matters because it shaped how the Blue Star Watch data was interpreted and recorded. A professional astronomer encountering the same unusual periodic object would have approached it with the standard tools of the discipline, attempting to characterize its orbital parameters precisely, working to assign it a catalogue designation, publishing findings in peer-reviewed journals, and inviting the scientific community to verify or dispute the observations. The analysts did none of those things. They watched, they recorded, they cross-referenced. They kept the information in a restricted database that no outside researcher could access, and they formed conclusions not from the astronomical characteristics of the object in isolation, but from the object's behaviour in relation to the full body of evidence they had been accumulating. That context, 50 years of classified cultural intelligence, geological monitoring, atmospheric data, and prophetic correlation analysis, gave the Blue Star Watch its particular significance. To an outside astronomer, an unusual periodic object with a blue spectral signature would have been an interesting astronomical puzzle. To the analysts who had spent their careers immersed in the archive, the same object was something else entirely. It was a data point in a pattern they had been watching for decades. A pattern that, according to every line of analysis they had applied to it, was converging towards something. The object's next closest approach, as estimated in the 2002 projection document, fell within a window that the archive's cultural intelligence timeline had long identified as the period of highest transition probability. The specific years were not named in the projection. The analysts were careful about specificity in a way that suggests they were aware of how the material would read if it ever became public. They dealt in ranges and probabilities, not dates. But the ranges and probabilities they recorded, when placed alongside the Hopi prophetic timeline, and the climate modelling projections and the geological and atmospheric anomaly data, pointed in the same direction. Mid-21st century. That phrase appears in multiple documents from multiple analytical threads within the archive, not as a prediction of a specific catastrophic event, not as a countdown to destruction, but as the convergence point of multiple independent lines of evidence, each suggesting that the period between approximately 2025 and 2050 represented something significant in the long cyclical pattern that the archive had been assembled to document. We are, at the time this is being told, inside that window. This is not stated for effect. It is not an attempt to manufacture urgency where the documents themselves do not support it. It is simply the arithmetic of the archive's own projections applied to the calendar year in which this account is being presented. The analysts who prepared those projections are, most of them, no longer alive. The program that produced the archive may or may not still be active in some form. The specific server that Lucas Hale accessed has presumably been discovered and properly decommissioned by now. The files it contained either destroyed or moved to a more secure location. What remains is the account, the paper trail, the convergence of evidence assembled by people who had every professional reason to dismiss it, and found, year after year, decade after decade, that they could not. The Hopi elders who spoke publicly, Dan Evihima, Thomas Banyasia, and others whose names appear in the cultural intelligence files, knew that they were unlikely to see the transition themselves. They were old men delivering warnings to a world that largely was not listening. They were not delivering those warnings out of desperation, or because they expected the warnings to prevent what was coming. The Hopi understanding of the transition is not that it can be stopped. It is that it can be navigated, that the difference between surviving the passage between worlds and not surviving it lies not in avoiding the transition, but in being prepared for it, in carrying the right things through, in understanding enough about what is happening to respond to it with the wisdom that the situation requires, rather than the panic that the situation might provoke. This is why the ceremonies continue, not because the ceremonies can delay the transition or accelerate it, but because the ceremonies are the mechanism by which the knowledge is maintained, by which the pattern is kept alive in human awareness, by which the thread of continuity that has been held across previous cycles, through the fire and the ice and the water, is held in this one as well. Whether the knowledge is sufficient, whether enough people carry it forward, whether the recognition the Hopi have been calling for finally comes in time to matter. These questions remain open. They have always remained open. They will remain open until the moment they are answered by the events themselves, and by the choices that the people living through those events make in the time they have. The archive is real, or it is not. The pattern is genuine, or it is an elaborate construction assembled by people who wanted to find a pattern and found what they were looking for. The blue star approaches, or it does not. The Sipapu is a sacred site at the confluence of two rivers in the Grand Canyon, or it is something more than that. The fourth world is in its final phase, or it has been in its final phase for so long that the phrase has lost its meaning. These questions cannot be resolved tonight. They may not be resolvable at all, in the sense that most people mean when they say they want an answer. Something definitive, something certain, something that closes the question and allows life to continue without the discomfort of not knowing. What can be said with certainty is this. The Hopi people have been on those mesas for more than 1,000 years. They have watched empires rise and fall around them. They have watched the world they knew transformed more than once into something unrecognizable. They have maintained their ceremonies and their knowledge and their understanding of the pattern through all of it. Not because they were protected from history, not because the events of the world left them untouched, but because they chose, generation after generation, to hold the thread. That is the part of the story that the government archive, for all its extraordinary documentation, never quite captured. Not the geological anomalies or the astronomical objects or the statistical correlations between prophecy and technological development. The part of the story that resists reduction to data points and correlation coefficients and classified memoranda is the part that happens every morning on the mesa, when the sun comes up over the Colorado Plateau and the ceremony is performed, and the knowledge is passed from the people who hold it to the people who will hold it next. That part of the story has been happening for longer than any government program has existed. It will keep happening after every government program has ended. And it will keep happening, if the Hopi are right about the pattern, on the other side of the threshold as well, in whatever world comes next. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review also helps out so much. And if you'd like, comment what time it is for you and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. And of course, if you enjoy the content, please consider subscribing. Now, let's dive into tonight's story. The Smithsonian's Darkest Secrets. What if the bones were too big to explain? Picture this: a team of excavators in Ohio, 1879, uncovering a burial mound. The dig proceeds normally until they reach the central chamber. There, arranged in ceremonial position, lies a skeleton. But something is wrong. The femur is too long. The skull is too large. The ribs extend far beyond normal human proportions. The team measures carefully. They document everything. They contact the Smithsonian Institution, America's premier scientific authority. Representatives arrive. They examine the remains. They carefully pack everything into crates. The crates are loaded onto wagons, then trains. They disappear into the vaults of the nation's most trusted museum. And then, according to some researchers, those bones are never seen again. This is the central allegation that has haunted the Smithsonian Institution for over a century. Not a single dramatic cover-up, but a pattern. A systematic removal of evidence that challenges our understanding of the past. Artifacts that don't fit the established narrative, quietly set aside. Discoveries that raise uncomfortable questions, lost in bureaucratic shadows. The Smithsonian Institution stands as the world's largest museum and research complex. 19 museums, 9 research centres, 140 million artifacts and specimens. It defines American history for generations of schoolchildren. It shapes our collective memory of who we were and how we came to be. Millions walk through its halls each year. They stand before dinosaur skeletons and moon rocks. They examine the Wright brothers' flyer and the Star-Spangled Banner. They trust that what they see represents the complete story of human achievement and natural history. But what if some discoveries never made it to the display cases? What if the story we've been told is incomplete? Not because of malicious conspiracy, but because institutions, like people, sometimes choose comfort over confrontation. Tonight, we examine the allegations. We follow the paper trails. We explore the missing artifacts, the vanished records, and the persistent claims that history has been edited before reaching our eyes. We'll hear from believers and skeptics. We'll examine evidence and counter-evidence. We'll ask uncomfortable questions about the institutions we trust to preserve truth. This is the story of the Smithsonian's Darkest Secrets, a story that begins not with malice, but with money, not with conspiracy, but with a gift that would change American science forever. Chapter 1: The Rise of an Authority. The Smithsonian Institution was born from the will of an Englishman who never visited America. James Smithson, a British scientist and mineralogist, died in 1829 in Genoa, Italy. His life had been devoted to scientific inquiry. He published 27 papers on chemistry and geology. He travelled throughout Europe collecting mineral specimens. He was a Fellow of the Royal Society, one of the most prestigious scientific organisations in the world. But Smithson harboured a resentment. He was the illegitimate son of the Duke of Northumberland. Though brilliant, he could never inherit his father's title or estate. British society, for all its scientific advancement, still judged men by birth rather than merit. Perhaps that's why his will contained such an extraordinary clause. If his nephew, Henry, James Hungerford, died without heirs, Smithson's entire estate would go to the United States government. The purpose: to found at Washington, under the name of the Smithsonian Institution, an establishment for the increase and diffusion of knowledge. Why America? Smithson never explained. He never visited the country. He had no known American connections. But he saw in the young republic something Britain lacked: the promise of meritocracy, a place where knowledge mattered more than lineage. The nephew died childless in 1835. The inheritance worth over $500,000 in gold sovereigns became available. This was an enormous sum, equivalent to well over $10 million today. But Congress hesitated. Should the United States accept a gift from a foreign citizen? What strings might be attached? What would this institution actually do? Debate raged for nearly a decade. Some wanted a national university, others proposed an observatory, a library, or a museum. Former President John Quincy Adams, then serving in Congress, championed the cause. He argued that accepting Smithson's gift was a matter of national honour. Finally, in 1846, President James Polk signed the act establishing the Smithsonian Institution. The legislation was deliberately vague about the institution's specific mission. It would promote knowledge. The details would evolve. Joseph Henry, a renowned physicist, became the first secretary. He envisioned the Smithsonian primarily as a research institution, not a museum. He wanted to fund original scientific investigation and publish findings. He was less interested in collecting objects, but the building itself suggested otherwise. Architect James Renwick designed a castle in red sandstone, with towers and crenellations evoking medieval fortresses of knowledge. It looked like a place to house treasures, not just conduct research. From the beginning, the Smithsonian faced a fundamental tension. Would it be a research institute or a museum? Would it generate new knowledge or preserve existing discoveries? The answer became both. And in trying to be both, it accumulated power. The timing was perfect. America in the mid-1800s was experiencing an explosion of archaeological discoveries. As the frontier expanded westward, as railroads cut through previously unmapped territory, as settlers ploughed fields and built foundations, they encountered evidence of ancient habitation. Burial mounds dotted the landscape from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Earthworks of staggering scale emerged from forests being cleared for farmland. Artifacts surfaced. Copper tools, shell beads, stone carvings, ceramic vessels. Who made these? The question consumed popular imagination. Native American tribes had oral histories about some sites, but the sheer scale of certain earthworks seemed beyond what small tribal groups could accomplish. Also, white Americans reasoned bringing their own biases to interpretation. The Smithsonian positioned itself as the authority on these questions. It dispatched researchers across the expanding nation. It collected specimens by the thousands. It established protocols for excavation and preservation. It decided what was scientifically significant and what was mere curiosity. Cyrus Thomas, employed by the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology, beginning in 1882, led extensive surveys of ancient mounds throughout the eastern United States. His mission was clear: determine who built the earthworks that puzzled settlers and scientists alike. Thomas was methodical. He visited hundreds of sites. He supervised excavations. He catalogued thousands of artifacts. He reviewed every account, every theory, every wild speculation about ancient builders. His conclusion, published in 1894 in a massive report, became institutional orthodoxy. The mounds were built by ancestors of contemporary Native American tribes, not by a separate vanished race. There were no lost civilizations, no mysterious mound builders. The engineering and labour were entirely within the capabilities of indigenous peoples. This was actually progressive for its time. It countered racist theories that Native Americans were too primitive to have built such structures. It acknowledged indigenous achievement and continuity. But it also established a pattern. The Smithsonian would define the boundaries of acceptable history. It would determine what theories deserved consideration and what theories were pseudoscience. It would decide which artifacts merited preservation and which could be discarded as unimportant. And with authority comes power. The power to decide what is remembered, the power to choose what is forgotten, the power to shape collective memory. By the early 20th century, the Smithsonian had become the central repository for American archaeology. If you discovered something significant, you contacted the Smithsonian. If you wanted funding for excavation, you needed Smithsonian approval. If you hoped to publish findings in respected journals, you needed Smithsonian endorsement. This centralization had benefits. It prevented duplication of effort. It raised standards for archaeological practice, it protected sites from amateur looters, but it also created vulnerability. A single institution now controlled access to much of the physical evidence of America's past. And if that institution had blind spots, biases, or reasons to avoid certain questions, there were few checks on its authority. The conspiracy theories that would haunt the institution for the next century were already taking root. Because as the Smithsonian accumulated artifacts by the tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, questions arose that have never been satisfactorily answered. What happened to everything they collected? Where did it all go? How were decisions made about what to study, what to display, what to store, and what to quietly remove from consideration? And if something challenged their conclusions, would they have any incentive to share it? Or would the easier path be to set it aside, catalogue it vaguely, and let it disappear into the vast collections where few would ever look? These weren't unreasonable questions then. They aren't unreasonable now. Chapter 2. The Giant Skeleton Claims. The newspaper accounts are extensive and surprisingly consistent. The New York Times, November 10th, 1880, page 5. A giant's bones. The body of a man 11 feet 4 inches high discovered near Middletown, Ohio. The San Diego Union, August 5th, 1877. Front page, remains of giants unearthed, skeletons of extraordinary size found in California burial mounds. The Indianapolis News, November 10th, 1875. Remains of gigantic size disinterred near Greencastle. The skeleton measured 8 feet from crown to heel. The Worthington, Advance, Minnesota, May 10th, 1888. A giant's bones unearthed. Remains measuring 9 feet in length found during excavation of Indian mound. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of similar reports appear in newspapers across America between 1850 and 1920. They describe the discovery of human skeletons measuring 7, 8, 9, even 10 feet tall, often found in burial mounds, frequently accompanied by copper tools, shell beads, and other artifacts suggesting ceremonial burial. The reports follow a remarkably consistent pattern. Local excavators, often farmers or construction workers, make a discovery while digging. They recognise the bones as human but note unusual size. They contact local authorities or newspapers. The story is published. Scientists or museum representatives are contacted. The remains are measured, documented and packed for transportation to institutions like the Smithsonian for further study. And then, according to conspiracy theorists, the trail goes cold. Researchers today who try to locate these skeletons in Smithsonian collections claim they cannot find them. The catalogue numbers don't match existing records. The accession documents are incomplete or missing. The specimens have been deaccessioned or lost in transfer, or simply cannot be located despite extensive searching. Let's examine a specific case in detail. In May of 1897, the Times of London reported on excavations in Lovelock Cave, Nevada. The site yielded numerous artifacts and skeletal remains. According to reports, some of the skeletons measured significantly above normal human height ranges. The tallest supposedly measured 8 feet, 4 inches. The excavation was supervised by James Hart Mercer, an archaeologist who worked with the Smithsonian. His field notes, which still exist in archives, describe skeletal material of unusual dimensions. He arranged for the remains to be shipped to Washington for analysis. Modern researchers seeking these specific bones have been unable to locate them in Smithsonian collections. The institution acknowledges receiving materials from Lovelock Cave, but the catalogue descriptions don't match Mercer's field notes. Heights listed are within normal ranges. The unusually large specimens are absent. What happened? 3 possibilities. First, the measurements were wrong. Mercer was working in difficult conditions. Bones were fragmentary. He might have misassembled remains or measured incorrectly. Second, the bones were misidentified. Large animal bones were mistaken for human remains. This happened frequently in early archaeology. Third, the bones existed as described but have since been lost, destroyed, or deliberately removed from the collection. The conspiracy theory embraces the third explanation, but the first two are more probable, and yet the pattern repeats across dozens of cases. The most famous allegation involves a Supreme Court case that never actually happened. In 2005, a story began circulating online. It claimed the Smithsonian Institution had been sued in federal court for destroying evidence of giant skeletons. The supposed lawsuit was filed by the American Institution of Alternative Archaeology. The court allegedly ruled in favour of the plaintiffs, ordering the Smithsonian to release classified documents proving the institution had destroyed tens of thousands of giant human remains in the early 1900s. The story was elaborate. It included fake quotes from Smithsonian officials admitting the destruction. It referenced specific case numbers and court dates. It spread rapidly through conspiracy theory websites and social media. Except none of this happened. There is no such court case, no ruling, no American Institution of Alternative Archaeology. The entire story was a fabrication, created by a satirical website and then taken seriously by people who wanted to believe it. When confronted with the hoax, true believers didn't abandon the theory. They claimed the debunking itself was part of the cover-up. The fact that no evidence existed for the lawsuit proved how powerful the conspiracy was. But the fabricated lawsuit built on a foundation of genuine mystery. Because those 19th century newspaper reports are real, they exist in archives. You can read them yourself in digitised historical newspaper collections. So what explains them? The official position is straightforward and, honestly, pretty convincing. Early American archaeology was chaotic and unscientific. Professional archaeology didn't really exist as a discipline. Most excavations were conducted by amateurs. Measurements were inaccurate, standards for documentation didn't exist. Giants were actually normal skeletons that appeared larger due to several factors. Soil displacement and geological pressure could spread bones apart, making them seem larger than life size. Decomposition and mineralization could cause bones to expand. Enthusiastic local boosters exaggerated findings to attract attention and tourists. Newspapers of that era printed sensational stories without rigorous verification. If a farmer claimed he found giant bones, the local paper might print it without investigation. Some cases have clear, documented explanations. A giant skeleton discovered in New York in 1871 turned out to be a mastodon. The initial report described it as human before expert examination revealed the truth. A mysterious 7-foot skull found in Missouri in 1894 was from a cave bear. The finder genuinely believed it was human. Only later analysis corrected the identification. The Cardiff giant, perhaps the most famous giant of the era, was an outright hoax. A 10-foot-tall stone figure uncovered in New York in 1869. Thousands paid to see it. Scientists from Yale examined it. Some declared it proof of ancient giants mentioned in the Bible. It was eventually revealed as a carved gypsum statue, created by an atheist named George Hull specifically to mock biblical literalism. But not before making its creator thousands of dollars and fooling numerous educated people. If educated scientists could be fooled by an obvious fake carved from soft stone, how much easier would it be for amateurs to misidentify unusual animal bones? But not all reports fit this explanation. Some described skeletons excavated by trained observers. Some included multiple independent witnesses. Some were documented by reputable scientists of the era who should have known the difference between human and animal remains. In 1891, Professor Thomas Wilson of the Smithsonian's Department of Prehistoric Anthropology wrote about excavations in Ohio. His report mentioned human remains of extraordinary stature found in association with clearly human artifacts. Wilson was a trained anthropologist. He wasn't likely to confuse a mastodon with a human. What happened to the remains he described? They should be in the collection. The catalogue numbers exist, but the specimens cannot be found. The conspiracy theory asks a simple question. If even a handful of these reports were accurate, if humans significantly taller than normal once lived in North America, what happened to the evidence? And the answer conspiracy theorists arrive at is equally simple. The Smithsonian made it disappear, not because of malice, not because of some grand plan, but because these remains didn't fit the accepted narrative of human development. They raised questions that couldn't be easily answered. They complicated the story the institution was tasked with telling, so they were set aside, catalogued vaguely, stored in boxes that nobody opened, and over decades they were simply lost in the vast holdings of an ever-growing collection. Is this what happened? We can't know for certain, but the gaps in the record remain, and gaps, once noticed, are hard to ignore. Chapter 3. Missing Artifacts and Vanished Records. In 1991, a researcher named Vine Deloria Jr. published a book called Red Earth, White Lies, Native Americans and the Myth of Scientific Fact. Deloria was a Standing Rock Sioux, author, theologian, historian and activist. He held degrees from Iowa State, the Lutheran School of Theology, and a law degree from the University of Colorado. He wasn't a fringe conspiracy theorist. He was a serious scholar with legitimate credentials. His book challenged conventional archaeology on multiple fronts. But one chapter focused specifically on the Smithsonian Institution. He claimed the institution had a pattern of losing or discarding artifacts that didn't fit accepted timelines for human habitation in the Americas. Deloria cited specific examples. Stone tools found in geological layers at Hueyatlaco, Mexico, supposedly too old for human presence in the Americas. The tools existed, the excavation was professional, but the implications were so disruptive to accepted chronology that the findings were marginalized. Carved figurines from Nampa, Idaho, depicting extinct animals that humans weren't supposed to have encountered. The figurines were genuine artifacts, but they were found in geological contexts that suggested impossible antiquity. Rather than forcing reconsideration of timelines, they were labelled as somehow displaced or contaminated. Metal objects from cultures that supposedly hadn't developed metallurgy. Copper axes, bronze implements, iron tools found in contexts that predated when these technologies were supposed to exist in the Americas. Deloria's claim wasn't that the Smithsonian was maliciously destroying evidence. His argument was more subtle and in some ways more damning. He suggested the institution had become so invested in a particular narrative of American prehistory that it couldn't accommodate evidence that challenged that narrative. Artifacts that fit the story were carefully preserved, studied and displayed. Artifacts that didn't fit were treated with skepticism, catalogued vaguely, stored in less accessible locations and gradually forgotten. He cited excavation reports that referenced artifacts no longer in collections, catalogue numbers that led nowhere, requests to examine specimens that were denied or redirected to different materials entirely. Other researchers echoed these concerns. They pointed to early 20th century expedition reports that described remarkable finds that should have revolutionized understanding of ancient America. But the artifacts described in those reports couldn't be located in current collections. An 1897 expedition to Tennessee Mounds, led by Smithsonian archaeologists, documented in their field report the discovery of unusual metallurgical specimens showing evidence of smelting techniques not previously documented in eastern woodlands cultures. The catalogue, numbers assigned to these items, still exist in the archives, but the items themselves cannot be found. A 1913 field notebook from an Arkansas excavation describes carved stones bearing undeciphered symbols suggesting organised writing system. The notebook is carefully preserved in the Smithsonian archives. Researchers can read the detailed descriptions, view the hand-drawn sketches of the symbols, but the stones themselves are not in the collection. An 1884 letter from a Smithsonian curator to a colleague mentions receiving skeletal material of unusual proportions, requiring further anatomical study. No follow-up correspondence exists. No study was published. The specimens are not listed in current catalogues. Are these innocent casualties of time and institutional change? Almost certainly some are. The Smithsonian has experienced fires, floods and relocations. Materials have been damaged or destroyed through accident rather than intent. Early cataloguing systems were inconsistent. Items were sometimes accessioned under descriptions that don't match current search terms. Storage facilities have changed. Collections have been reorganised multiple times. All of this creates natural gaps in institutional memory. but the pattern of gaps surrounding specifically anomalous artifacts is striking. Items that would have been controversial, that challenged accepted theories, seem disproportionately likely to be among the lost. The Smithsonian's response has been consistent. Early archaeological practice was poor. Documentation was incomplete. Many early excavations were conducted by amateurs who made claims without proper evidence. Items were sometimes accessioned based on donor descriptions that later proved inaccurate or exaggerated. When the institution couldn't verify the provenance or authenticity of an artifact, it was de-accessioned. This wasn't conspiracy. It was responsible museum practice. Museums cannot keep everything. Decisions must be made about what merits preservation and what doesn't. But critics point out an uncomfortable reality. Who decides what can be verified? What standards of evidence are applied? And if an artifact challenges fundamental assumptions about the past, might there be unconscious bias in how rigorously it's examined? If a stone arrowhead is found and donated, it's probably accepted with minimal scrutiny. It fits what we expect. But if a complex mechanism is found in an ancient context, might it face higher standards of proof? Might researchers look harder for reasons to dismiss it? This is the insidious nature of confirmation bias. It's not deliberate dishonesty. It's the human tendency to accept evidence that confirms existing beliefs and scrutinize evidence that challenges them. The deeper researchers dig into Smithsonian records, the more gaps they find. And these aren't just random gaps. They cluster around specific types of claims, evidence of human presence in the America's earlier than accepted timelines, evidence of technological sophistication in cultures deemed primitive, evidence of anatomical variation in ancient human populations, evidence of cultural achievements that challenge narratives of linear progress. Each individual gap might have an innocent explanation, but the pattern of gaps creates suspicion, and once that suspicion exists, absence of evidence becomes its own kind of proof. If the Smithsonian isn't hiding anything, why can't they produce the artifacts described in their own historical records? Why aren't the specimens mentioned in century-old expedition reports available for modern analysis with advanced techniques? The official answer remains: they probably never existed as described, or they weren't what people thought they were, or they were lost through ordinary institutional processes over more than a century of operations. But conspiracy theorists hear a different message. They did exist. They were exactly what people thought, and now they're conveniently gone. Chapter 4. Advanced Ancient Knowledge. The stone walls at Sacsayhuaman in Peru fit together so precisely that you cannot slide a knife blade between them. Some blocks weigh over 200 tons. They were somehow transported miles from quarries, lifted into position, and cut with such accuracy that no mortar was needed. The Great Pyramid of Giza was the tallest human-made structure on Earth for over 3,500 years. Its base is level to within less than an inch. Its sides align almost perfectly with true north. The interior passages demonstrate sophisticated understanding of mathematics and engineering. The Antikythera mechanism, recovered from a Roman-era shipwreck off Greece in 1901, contains gear systems and astronomical calculations that wouldn't appear again in European technology for over a millennium. It predicted solar eclipses, tracked planetary movements, and calculated the Olympic Games cycle. Ancient civilizations achieved things that challenge our understanding of their capabilities. This is not conspiracy theory. This is established fact, acknowledged by mainstream archaeology. But the question becomes, how much more advanced were they than we acknowledge? And more importantly, what evidence of that advancement has been minimized, overlooked, or deliberately ignored because it doesn't fit comfortable narratives of gradual technological progress? Some conspiracy theorists claim the Smithsonian has actively downplayed evidence of technological sophistication in ancient cultures, particularly in the Americas. The allegation isn't that ancient people had computers or aircraft. It's more subtle and, honestly, more plausible. The claim is that evidence of advanced knowledge, precision engineering, and sophisticated understanding of mathematics, astronomy, and metallurgy has been systematically minimized to maintain a narrative of gradual, linear progress from primitive to advanced. The favourite model in mainstream archaeology is evolutionary. Hunter-gatherers become farmers. Farmers build villages. Villages become cities. Cities develop writing. Writing enables mathematics. Mathematics enables engineering. Each step follows predictably, logically, from the last. It's a comforting narrative. It suggests progress is inevitable. It implies our current civilization is the pinnacle of human achievement. But what if the pattern wasn't so linear? What if ancient people understood principles we think they couldn't have grasped? What if technological knowledge was sometimes lost rather than continuously accumulated? Conspiracy theorists point to specific examples that trouble mainstream explanations. The Peary-Reyes map of 1513 shows coastal details of South America with remarkable accuracy. More controversially, it appears to show coastline features of Antarctica that wouldn't be mapped by modern explorers until centuries later. The map's creator, Ottoman Admiral Peary-Reyes, claimed he based it on much older source maps, some dating to the time of Alexander the Great. How did ancient cartographers map Antarctica? The conventional answer: they didn't. The map shows South America's coast, and the Antarctic portion is misidentified coastline or pure fabrication. But the accuracy of other portions of the map makes this explanation less satisfying. The Baghdad battery, discovered in Iraq in 1936, consists of a clay jar containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod. When filled with acidic liquid, it generates small electric current. It dates to approximately 2,000 years ago. Was this actually a battery, or just a scroll container that happens to generate current as a side effect? Mainstream archaeology favours the latter, but experimental archaeology has shown these devices could effectively electroplate objects. Did ancient metallurgists understand principles of electrochemistry? Precision-drilled holes in granite at ancient Egyptian sites show characteristics that modern engineers associate with high-speed drilling equipment. The holes are perfectly circular, maintain consistent diameter through hard stone, and show spiral grooves suggesting rapid rotation. Conventional archaeology argues they were made with copper tools and sand abrasive, through patient application of rotational pressure. But experimental attempts to replicate these holes using proposed ancient methods have struggled to match the precision and speed suggested by the archaeological evidence. The Smithsonian's position on these artifacts is carefully calibrated. The institution acknowledges the sophistication. It marvels at ancient ingenuity. Its exhibits celebrate the achievements of past civilizations. But it argues these achievements are explainable within the bounds of known, ancient technology and knowledge. The Peary-Reyes map drew on older sources, but those sources were medieval or classical, not impossibly ancient. The Baghdad battery might have been used for electroplating, but this doesn't prove systematic understanding of electricity. The Egyptian drillings were accomplished through techniques we haven't fully rediscovered, but that doesn't mean they required advanced technology. The conspiracy theorist argues, but what if we're underestimating these civilizations not because of evidence, but because we're committed to a particular narrative of human development? What if our models of technological progress are oversimplified? What if we've set the bar for ancient achievement artificially low, then use that lowered bar to dismiss evidence that exceeds it? Consider a specific case that illustrates this tension. In 1964, geologist Virginia Steen McIntyre was part of a team dating artifacts from Huatlaco, Mexico. They used multiple dating methods: uranium series, tetrahydration, and stratigraphic analysis. All methods consistently indicated the tools were over 250,000 years old. This created an obvious problem. Anatomically, modern humans weren't supposed to exist 250,000 years ago, let alone in the Americas. The accepted timeline for human migration to the Americas was roughly 12,000 to 15,000 years ago. Steen McIntyre's findings, if accurate, would demolish that timeline. They would require complete reconsideration of human evolution and migration patterns. Her findings were rejected. Papers were refused publication. Colleagues distanced themselves. Her career suffered significantly. She later claimed she experienced direct institutional pressure from organizations including the Smithsonian. Pressure to reinterpret the data. Suggestions that her dating methods must be flawed. implications that publishing such findings would damage her professional reputation. Was this conspiracy? Or was it simply the scientific process working as intended, subjecting extraordinary claims to extraordinary scrutiny? The line between healthy skepticism and close-minded orthodoxy is extremely thin, and institutions like the Smithsonian, which help define where that line falls, hold enormous power over what becomes accepted knowledge. Steen McIntyre's work remains controversial. Some researchers argue her dating methods were sound, and archaeology needs to reconsider timelines. Others maintain the dates must be incorrect because they conflict with overwhelming evidence from other fields. But notice what happened. The evidence wasn't destroyed, it wasn't hidden, it was questioned, criticised, and largely dismissed. The artefacts still exist, but they've been relegated to anomaly status. They don't appear in textbooks, they don't inform the standard narrative taught to students. This is a subtler form of information control than physical destruction of artefacts. It's the power to decide what evidence matters, what deserves attention, what merits inclusion in the official story. And that power, exercised over decades by institutions like the Smithsonian, shapes our entire understanding of the past. Chapter 5. Indigenous History and Narrative Control. The Mound Builder myth was one of 19th century America's most destructive historical frauds, and one with lasting consequences. It went like this. The impressive earthworks and burial mounds throughout the eastern United States were too sophisticated, too large, too precisely engineered to have been built by Native Americans. They must have been constructed by a separate, vanished race of mound builders who possessed advanced knowledge and civilization. These mysterious mound builders were variously theorized to be lost tribes of Israel who migrated to the Americas, wandering Europeans or Phoenicians who reached North America in antiquity, survivors from Atlantis or other legendary civilizations, an advanced race that was later conquered or absorbed by primitive native tribes. This wasn't just academic speculation. It served a direct political purpose. If Native Americans hadn't built the mounds, they had no special historical claim to the lands that contained them. They were recent arrivals, just like European colonists. Therefore, westward expansion could proceed with reduced moral complication. If indigenous peoples weren't connected to the ancient civilizations that once flourished here, their displacement was less troubling. The myth was widespread, believed by prominent Americans, including Thomas Jefferson, who wrote about it extensively. It appeared in newspapers, textbooks, and scientific journals. It shaped policy and public opinion. The Smithsonian's Cyrus Thomas demolished this myth with his 1894 report on the mound explorations of the Bureau of Ethnology. He proved conclusively through careful excavation and analysis that Native American ancestors built the mounds. The engineering was entirely within the capabilities of indigenous peoples. The cultural continuity was clear. This was real scholarship, opposing racist pseudo-history. Thomas deserves credit for applying scientific rigour to politically charged questions. But some researchers claim the Smithsonian went too far in the opposite direction. In the effort to combat the mound builder myth, they argue, the institution minimised the genuine complexity and sophistication of pre-Columbian North American civilizations. The conspiracy theory goes like this. Acknowledging truly advanced indigenous civilizations would raise uncomfortable questions. It would force recognition of what was lost during European colonization. It would complicate the narrative of European civilization bringing progress and enlightenment to a primitive continent. It would create moral and legal complications regarding land rights and historical injustice, so evidence of that complexity and advancement when it appeared was acknowledged but not emphasized. It was studied but not celebrated. It was preserved but not prominently displayed. Consider Cahokia, the ancient city near modern St. Louis, Missouri. At its peak around the year 1100, Cahokia was larger than London. Its population exceeded 10,000, possibly reaching 20,000. Its central plaza covered 40 acres. Monk's Mound, the largest earthwork, rose 100 feet high and covered 14 acres at its base. It contained more material than the Great Pyramid of Giza. This was an urban civilization. It had sophisticated agriculture supporting large populations, extensive trade networks reaching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, complex social hierarchies and specialised labour, advanced astronomical knowledge demonstrated by structures precisely aligned with solstices and equinoxes. Cahokia was not a village, it was a metropolis, and it existed at the same time as medieval European cities, yet how many Americans learned about Cahokia in school? For most people educated before the late 20th century, the answer is none. It simply wasn't taught. It wasn't part of the standard curriculum. It didn't appear in history textbooks alongside accounts of European medieval cities. Why not? The evidence was there. Archaeologists knew about Cahokia. The Smithsonian had extensive materials from the site. But Cahokia didn't fit the narrative. It complicated the story of indigenous peoples as primarily hunter-gatherer societies. It suggested pre-Columbian civilization in North America was far more advanced than commonly believed. The city collapsed mysteriously around 1300, before European contact. Climate change, resource depletion, social upheaval, possibly epidemic disease. The reasons remain debated. But its very existence challenged comfortable assumptions. So it was studied by specialists but not integrated into popular understanding of American history. This is changing. Cahokia is now recognised as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It appears in modern textbooks. Public awareness is growing, but for over a century, despite being the largest pre-Columbian settlement north of Mexico, it was effectively absent from mainstream historical consciousness. The conspiracy theory asks, what else don't we know? What other achievements were documented, then quietly forgotten? What evidence of indigenous technological advancement, astronomical knowledge, or cultural complexity never made it into textbooks because it was inconvenient? Consider another example, the astronomical alignments at Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. Chaco was a major centre of ancestral Puebloan culture from approximately 850 to 1150. Its great houses are precisely aligned with solar and lunar cycles. Structures mark solstices, equinoxes, and lunar standstills with remarkable accuracy. This demonstrates sophisticated astronomical observations sustained over generations. It required detailed record-keeping, mathematical understanding, and engineering precision. Yet for decades, mainstream archaeology attributed these alignments to coincidence, or was simply silent about them. The idea that primitive societies carefully tracked celestial movements made some scholars uncomfortable. It suggested knowledge and sophistication that didn't fit prevailing assumptions. Modern archaeology fully acknowledges Chacoan astronomical knowledge, but for how long was this evidence available but not emphasized? The pattern repeats. Evidence exists of ancient indigenous achievement. Evidence is preserved in museums and academic collections, but evidence is not prominently displayed, not featured in textbooks, not integrated into popular understanding. Is this conspiracy? Not in the traditional sense. It's something more subtle and perhaps more pervasive. Cultural bias expressed through curatorial choices made over decades. The Smithsonian didn't destroy evidence of indigenous achievement, but did it choose to emphasize certain narratives while downplaying others? Did it make decisions about what merited prominent display versus storage in archives? And were those decisions influenced, consciously or unconsciously, by prevailing cultural attitudes about indigenous peoples? Modern archaeology is correcting this. Indigenous scholars are reclaiming their history. Collaborative projects between researchers and tribal nations are producing more complete, more accurate accounts of the past. The Smithsonian itself has become more collaborative, more inclusive, more willing to acknowledge indigenous expertise about their own histories. But the question persists. How much time was lost? How many artifacts were categorized incorrectly, stored improperly, or simply ignored because they didn't fit expected narratives? And how would we know what we're missing? If evidence was never prominently displayed, if it never entered public consciousness, if it languished in storage for a century, the effect is the same as if it never existed. This is the power of institutional gatekeeping, not to destroy truth, but to determine which truths receive attention. Chapter 6. Whistleblower Stories. The stories appear on forums, blogs, and alternative research websites with remarkable consistency. Different authors, different time periods, but similar themes. A former Smithsonian curator, speaking on condition of anonymity, claims they were instructed to reclassify certain artefacts to less provocative categories. Items initially catalogued as undetermined origin or requires further study were recategorized as natural formation or modern contamination without additional analysis. A researcher who worked in the institution's storage facilities in the 1980s describes being told certain areas were off limits without clear explanation. When they asked about specific catalogue numbers that should have been in those restricted areas, they were redirected to different materials entirely. An archaeologist who submitted findings to Smithsonian journals in the 1990s claims their work was rejected not for methodological flaws but for implications that would confuse the public. The rejection letter, which they claimed to have kept but never publicly shared, supposedly stated that while the research was sound, publication would generate more questions than the current evidence base can answer. A museum technician who worked at the Smithsonian in the 2000s reports finding boxes in deep storage labelled with catalogue numbers that didn't appear in digital databases. When they brought this discrepancy to supervisors' attention, they were told the items were awaiting proper cataloguing and not to worry about it. The technician claims they later tried to locate those same boxes and couldn't find them. These accounts are impossible to verify. No names are provided, no documentation is offered. No corroborating witnesses come forward. They exist in that frustrating grey zone between plausible and provable. Could these things have happened? Absolutely. Institutional politics exist everywhere. Museums make curatorial decisions that aren't always transparent. Researchers do face pressure to conform to accepted narratives, but without verification, these stories remain rumour. They prove nothing beyond the fact that people are willing to claim such things occurred, yet they persist and multiply. The pattern of anonymous whistleblower accounts has become part of conspiracy culture around the Smithsonian. The most detailed account comes from a person claiming to be a former Smithsonian anthropologist who worked there in the 1970s. This account has circulated online in various forms for years. According to this story, the individual was assigned to catalogue skeletal remains from southwestern excavations conducted in the 1960s. The remains were from multiple sites, most fitting normal demographic patterns for the cultures and time periods involved. But among the hundreds of specimens, several stood out. The account describes skeletal remains showing unusual proportions, not wildly outside normal ranges, but statistically anomalous. Heights that would have been remarkable for the populations and time periods they supposedly represented. Upon reporting these unusual specimens to supervisors, the whistleblower claims they were initially told to document everything normally. Measurements were taken, photographs were made, preliminary analysis was conducted. But then, according to the account, the unusual specimens were separated from the main collection. They were moved to a different storage area. The individual was informed that further analysis had determined the measurements were erroneous due to bone displacement and mineralization effects. When they asked to see the revised analysis, they were told it was handled by senior staff and wasn't available for review. The unusual specimens were reclassified as within normal variation. The original measurements were noted as preliminary and superseded. No further study was conducted that the whistleblower was aware of. The specimens were filed away. The catalogue entries made no mention of the initial unusual findings. The account continues. When this individual asked colleagues about the situation, they were told, off the record, that the institution had guidelines about what kinds of claims could be made based on skeletal evidence. Extraordinary measurements required extraordinary context and documentation. Without clear provenance and supporting evidence, it was better to err on the side of conservative interpretation. One supervisor allegedly told them, "We don't have context for these anomalies. Without context, they create more confusion than clarity. Our job is to educate the public, not generate sensational headlines." The whistleblower claims they remained at the Smithsonian for several more years, but grew increasingly uncomfortable with what they perceived as unwillingness to pursue uncomfortable questions. They eventually left for a position elsewhere and later shared their story anonymously. Is this account real? There's no way to confirm it. The level of detail suggests someone with genuine institutional knowledge. The described procedures sound plausible for how large museums operate. But it could also be complete fabrication by someone familiar with museum operations, creating a story that sounds authentic without being verifiable. This is the essential problem with whistleblower accounts. They exist in the absence of hard evidence. They appeal to people already suspicious of institutions. They confirm existing beliefs rather than challenging them. And yet, complete dismissal seems unwarranted. Institutions do sometimes prioritize reputation over transparency. Scientists do face pressure to conform. Curatorial decisions are sometimes made for political or practical reasons rather than purely scientific ones. The truth probably lies somewhere between conspiracy and complete innocence. Not deliberate destruction of evidence, but a culture that favours certain kinds of findings over others. Not malicious cover-up, but selective attention driven by unconscious bias and institutional inertia. That's actually more concerning than cartoon villainy, because it's harder to address and easier to deny. Chapter 7. Why the Smithsonian is targeted. Why does the Smithsonian attract these conspiracy theories while other museums largely escape similar accusations? The answer lies in the institution's unique position within American cultural and scientific infrastructure. The Smithsonian isn't just another museum. It's the museum. It's a federal institution, with authority and resources unmatched by any private collection. It sets standards for museum practice nationwide. It influences educational curricula. Its conclusions shape textbooks, documentaries, and public understanding of history and science. When the Smithsonian makes a determination about an artifact's age, origin, or significance, that determination carries weight across the entire field. Other institutions defer to Smithsonian expertise. Publishers rely on Smithsonian research. Teachers present Smithsonian conclusions as established fact. This creates enormous responsibility, and responsibility creates pressure. The institution holds more American archaeological and anthropological material than any other organisation. If something was discovered in the United States and deemed scientifically significant in the last century and a half, there's a substantial probability it ended up in Smithsonian collections. This creates a paradox. The organisation most capable of preserving and studying controversial evidence is also the organisation most invested in established narratives. It has the most to lose from paradigm shifts that would invalidate decades of previous work, publications, and institutional positions. Think about the incentive structure. You're a Smithsonian curator with decades of experience. You've published extensively on the peopling of the Americas, arguing for the Clovis first model, which suggested humans arrived in the Americas around 13,000 years ago, via the Bering Land Bridge. Then evidence emerges suggesting much earlier human presence. Monteverde in Chile, dated to 14,500 years ago. Pre-Clovis sites in North America. Genetic evidence suggesting multiple migration waves. This evidence contradicts your life's work. Do you immediately embrace the new findings and acknowledge your previous conclusions were wrong? Subject the new evidence to rigorous scrutiny, looking for methodological flaws. Resist paradigm change until the evidence becomes absolutely overwhelming. Most scientists choose option 2, which is actually appropriate. Extraordinary claims should face rigorous examination, but there's a fine line between healthy skepticism and entrenched resistance. And when an entire institution has built its reputation on certain historical narratives, that line becomes even harder to navigate. The Smithsonian is also tied to government, which amplifies conspiracy thinking. It's formally a trust instrumentality of the United States, created by Congress and partially funded through federal appropriations. This connection to government makes it a target for people who generally distrust federal institutions. If you believe the government routinely lies to citizens about significant matters, why wouldn't that extend to the Smithsonian? If cover-ups occur in national security or politics, why not in archaeology? The theory becomes less about specific malicious acts and more about institutional inertia and risk avoidance. Consider a scenario. A donor brings an artifact to the Smithsonian. It's unusual. Initial analysis suggests it might challenge accepted timelines for technological development in ancient cultures, but the provenance is unclear. The context is ambiguous. You, as a curator, have several options. Display it prominently, acknowledging uncertainty but inviting public engagement with the mystery. Study it extensively, committing significant resources to what might ultimately prove to be a misidentified or contaminated specimen. Catalogue it conservatively, note the uncertainties, and store it for potential future study when better analytical methods might be available. Set it aside as insufficiently documented to merit serious attention. Which choice serves the institution's mission of education and research? Which serves your career advancement? Which protects the institution's reputation for scientific rigour? Which creates the least immediate disruption? In most cases, the conservative choice wins, not because of conspiracy, but because of bureaucracy, because of limited resources and competing priorities, because of reputational concerns and risk aversion. And over decades, those individual conservative choices accumulate. They create patterns. They generate gaps between what exists in collections and what receives attention. And gaps, once noticed by persistent researchers, fuel conspiracy theories. The Smithsonian also suffers from its own success. Its collections are so vast, 140 million items, that complete organisation and accessibility is nearly impossible. Even with modern database technology, materials slip through cracks. Catalogue numbers don't match physical locations. Items are stored in facilities that don't have comprehensive digital inventories. This ordinary chaos of managing massive collections becomes sinister when researchers can't find specific items they're looking for. The mundane explanation is, the collections are huge and imperfectly organised. The conspiratorial explanation is, items were deliberately hidden or removed. Both might be partially true. The collections are huge and imperfectly organised, and some items were probably deliberately set aside, not out of conspiracy, but out of curatorial judgment about what merited limited resources and attention. The institution has also made genuine mistakes throughout its history. It's displayed forgeries as authentic artifacts. It's made claims about human evolution that later proved incorrect. It's supported now debunked theories about ancient cultures. These mistakes are actually evidence that science works through self-correction. They show the institution is capable of admitting error and updating positions based on new evidence. But they also demonstrate fallibility. And once people realise an authority is fallible, trust becomes conditional rather than automatic. The Smithsonian conspiracy theories endure because the institution occupies a unique position combining enormous authority over historical narratives, federal government connection, vast collections with inevitable organisational imperfections, history of genuine mistakes and course corrections, incentive structures that favour conservative interpretations. This combination makes it a natural target for conspiracy thinking, regardless of whether actual conspiratorial behaviour has occurred. Chapter 8. Official Responses and Rebuttals. The Smithsonian Institution has addressed these conspiracy theories multiple times over the decades, with increasing frustration as the internet age has amplified their spread. Their official position is remarkably consistent. The institution does not destroy evidence for ideological or political reasons. The institution does not hide artifacts that challenge established theories. The institution applies rigorous scientific standards to all specimens, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. When conspiracy theorists point to 19th century, newspaper accounts of giant skeletons, Smithsonian representatives and mainstream archaeologists respond with several counter-arguments. First, early American archaeology lacked professional standards. Most excavations were conducted by amateurs with no formal training. Measurements were frequently inaccurate. Documentation was poor or non-existent. When a 19th century newspaper reports a skeleton measuring 9 feet, modern archaeologists ask, who measured it? What methods were used? Was the skeleton complete or reconstructed from fragments? Were the bones properly identified as human rather than animal remains? In most cases, these basic questions cannot be answered because the documentation doesn't exist. The newspaper reports offer sensational claims without methodological detail. Second, there are numerous documented cases of misidentification. Large animal bones were frequently mistaken for giant human remains. Mastodons, mammoths, and large extinct mammals left bones that could appear human to untrained observers. The giant skull, discovered in Missouri in 1894, initially reported as evidence of an ancient race of giants, was later identified as belonging to a cave bear. The finder was genuinely convinced it was human, but expert analysis proved otherwise. Without the actual bones available for modern analysis, we cannot know how many giant skeleton reports were similar misidentifications. Third, geological and biological processes can create illusions of greater size. Bones can be displaced by soil movement, making scattered remains appear to represent a larger individual than they actually do. Mineralization can cause bones to expand. Decomposition can separate remains in ways that suggest greater dimensions. Fourth, hoaxes were common. The Cardiff giant, the Piltdown Man, numerous other fraudulent discoveries fooled respected scientists in their time. If trained observers could be deceived by deliberate fakes, how much easier would it be for amateurs to misinterpret genuine remains? The absence of these giant skeletons in current collections has mundane explanations. They never existed as described. They were animal bones misidentified as human. They were normal human remains measured incorrectly. They were hoaxes. They were destroyed in fires, floods, or other disasters that affected museum collections. They were lost during one of the Smithsonian's several relocations and reorganizations. They were deaccessioned when provenance could not be verified. Any of these explanations is more probable than deliberate destruction to hide evidence. When conspiracy theorists claim specific artifacts have disappeared, Smithsonian archivists point out the realities of managing historical collections. The institution has accessioned materials for over 175 years. Early catalogue systems were inconsistent. Items were sometimes recorded under descriptions that don't match modern search. Terms, storage locations changed multiple times. Different departments used different numbering systems. Finding a specific artifact from a 19th century accession can be genuinely difficult, even for staff with full access to collections and databases. This doesn't mean the item was hidden. It means institutional memory is imperfect, and early record keeping was inadequate by modern standards. Additionally, museums regularly deaccession materials. This isn't destruction of evidence, it's responsible collection management. Items are deaccessioned when provenance cannot be verified. The item is a duplicate of better specimens already in the collection. The item is deteriorating beyond conservation capacity. The item was misidentified and doesn't actually represent what it was catalogued as. The item is more appropriate for a different institution's collection. These decisions are documented and reviewable. They're not secret, but they do mean that not everything ever accessioned remains permanently in the collection. When critics claim the institution downplays evidence of advanced ancient technology, archaeologists offer context. Ancient civilizations were sophisticated. This is acknowledged and celebrated. But sophistication doesn't mean they possess knowledge or technology beyond what we can demonstrate through evidence. The precision of Egyptian engineering is remarkable, but experimental archaeology has shown that proposed ancient methods could achieve similar results given sufficient time and labour. The Antikythera mechanism is extraordinary, but it's an outlier. We have no other examples of similar devices from that period, suggesting it was exceptional rather than representative of general technological capabilities. The Baghdad battery might have generated current, but that doesn't prove systematic understanding of electricity. It could be coincidental electrochemistry from a device designed for different purposes. The mainstream position isn't that ancient people were primitive, it's that we need solid evidence before attributing capabilities to them. Speculation should be clearly identified as such, rather than presented as fact. Regarding Indigenous history, the Smithsonian has acknowledged past failures to adequately recognise and display pre-Columbian achievements. Modern exhibits have corrected this. Collaborative programs with tribal nations have expanded. Indigenous voices are increasingly centred in interpretation of their own histories. These changes demonstrate institutional willingness to evolve and acknowledge past shortcomings. They show the Smithsonian responding to legitimate criticism. But conspiracy theorists interpret even these positive changes differently. They see them as admissions that evidence was previously suppressed. If the institution now acknowledges greater indigenous sophistication, doesn't that prove they were downplaying it before? The Smithsonian's response: understanding evolves. New research produces new insights. Changing interpretations reflects scientific progress, not previous conspiracy. When confronted with whistleblower accounts, the institution cannot respond to unverified, anonymous claims. If someone has evidence of wrongdoing, they should present it through proper channels. Anonymous forum posts prove nothing. The overall Smithsonian position boils down to science is a process. Our understanding of the past is constantly being refined. Mistakes have been made and corrected. But there is no systematic effort to hide evidence or suppress truth. Archaeologists argue that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If someone claims 10-foot-tall humans once lived in North America, we need more than newspaper clippings. We need bones, measurements, DNA analysis, and contextual evidence. If someone claims ancient Americans had advanced technology far beyond what we currently understand, we need artifacts that cannot be explained through known capabilities. Absence of such evidence, despite extensive archaeological work across the Americas, suggests the claims are unfounded. But for conspiracy theorists, official denials only deepen suspicion. Of course, the institution would deny wrongdoing. What else would they say? This is the impossible position institutions face when accused of conspiracy. Evidence of innocence can be dismissed as cover-up. Lack of evidence for conspiracy can be explained as successful concealment. The argument becomes unfalsifiable, and unfalsifiable claims aren't science, they're faith. Chapter 9. Why the Theory Endures. The Smithsonian conspiracy theory persists not primarily because of evidence, but because of context, because of how it fits into broader patterns of institutional distrust, because of how it answers uncomfortable questions, because it offers simple explanations for complex realities. Several factors ensure the theory's continued vitality despite lack of proof. First, early American archaeology did lack standards. This is historical fact. Before professional archaeology developed as a discipline in the early 20th century, excavation techniques were crude. Documentation was inconsistent or non-existent. Amateur enthusiasts conducted digs with no scientific training. Farmers unearthed burial mounds looking for valuables. Collectors hired labourers to dig for artefacts without recording context. Newspapers reported sensational finds without verification. This chaotic early period created a documentary record full of questionable claims, exaggerations, and outright frauds. Some of this material is now recognisable as false, but some sits in an ambiguous zone where we can neither prove nor disprove the claims. That ambiguity breeds speculation. If we can't definitively say certain reports were wrong, maybe they were right. And if they were right, where did the evidence go? Second, museums historically did make mistakes. They displayed forgeries. They supported incorrect theories. They made claims that later proved embarrassing. The Smithsonian exhibited the Cardiff Giant before it was proven to be a hoax. The institution supported now discredited theories about human evolution. It displayed archaeological interpretations that subsequent research contradicted. These are actually signs that science works through self-correction. They demonstrate that institutions can admit error and update positions. But they also demonstrate fallibility. And once people realise an authority can be wrong, every claim becomes potentially questionable. Third, real cover-ups have occurred in other contexts, fueling generalised distrust. Governments have hidden information about military experiments, environmental contamination, and public health risks. Corporations have suppressed research about product safety. Scientific institutions have at times been slow to acknowledge findings that challenged powerful interests. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment, tobacco industry research manipulation, pharmaceutical companies hiding adverse trial results. These proven conspiracies establish that institutions can and do conceal truth when motivated to do so. So when conspiracy theorists look at the Smithsonian, they reason, if cover-ups happen in medicine and industry and government, why not in archaeology? What makes museums immune to the same pressures? Fourth, genuine mysteries remain unsolved. Ancient engineering feats we don't fully understand, artifacts that don't fit neatly into established timelines, cultural achievements that seem advanced for their supposed technological context. Mainstream archaeology offers explanations, but they sometimes feel incomplete. They require imagining capabilities we can't quite reconstruct. They involve lost techniques we can only theorize about. In that gap between achievement and explanation, conspiracy theories flourish. If we don't know exactly how they did it, maybe they had help we're not acknowledging. Maybe evidence of that help has been suppressed. Fifth, the absence of proof becomes part of the narrative. If the Smithsonian isn't hiding anything, conspiracy theorists ask, why can't they produce the giant skeletons mentioned in those newspaper accounts? Why aren't the artifacts from old expedition reports available for study? The official answer is reasonable. The items probably never existed as described, or they were destroyed through ordinary causes, or they're simply lost in vast, imperfectly organised collections. But conspiracy theorists here, they existed, and someone made them disappear. This is the insidious logic of conspiracy thinking. Any gap in the record becomes potential evidence. Any missing data suggests intentional concealment. Absence of proof is reframed as proof of absence. Sixth, the theory is emotionally satisfying. It provides simple answers to complex questions. It creates villains and heroes. It suggests that truth is being suppressed but can be recovered through persistent investigation. It's more comfortable to believe in conspiracy than to accept that. Much of the past is genuinely unknowable. Documentary evidence is often unreliable. Our understanding is incomplete and uncertain. Some mysteries may never be solved. Conspiracy offers certainty. It says, we would know the truth if they hadn't hidden it. The knowledge exists, just concealed. This is psychologically easier than accepting fundamental uncertainty. Seventh, the internet has amplified and preserved conspiracy claims, while making authoritative rebuttals seem like just another opinion. Before the internet, conspiracy theories spread through books and word of mouth. They faced gatekeepers, publishers, librarians, educators who could evaluate credibility. Now, a blog post claiming Smithsonian cover-ups has the same accessibility as an official institutional statement, actually often more accessibility because conspiracy content is engineered for engagement while official responses are written in careful academic language. Search algorithms can't evaluate truth. They evaluate popularity and relevance. If thousands of people share a conspiracy claim, it rises in search results regardless of accuracy. Young people researching topics for school and counter-conspiracy websites alongside authoritative sources. Without training in source evaluation, how do they distinguish between them? Eighth, the conspiracy theory serves political and ideological purposes for some believers. For those who reject mainstream science on religious grounds, evidence that scientific authorities are unreliable supports their worldview. If the Smithsonian hides giant skeletons mentioned in the Bible, this confirms that secular science cannot be trusted. For those who oppose government and federal institutions on principle, the Smithsonian as a federal entity makes an appealing target. Proving federal dishonesty in one area justifies distrust in all areas. For those who feel marginalized by academic culture, conspiracy theories offer a way to claim superior knowledge. I know the truth that experts hide. These motivations ensure the theory's persistence regardless of evidence. The tragedy is that some legitimate questions get lost in conspiracy noise. Questions about how curatorial decisions are made and whether they involve unconscious bias. How institutional culture affects which research questions receive attention and resources. How gaps in historical knowledge should be acknowledged and communicated. How to balance certainty and uncertainty in public education. These are important questions worthy of serious discussion, but they get overshadowed by claims of deliberate deception and hidden giants. The Smithsonian conspiracy theory endures because it offers what humans crave: simple explanations, clear villains, and the promise that truth is just hidden, not genuinely unknown. Reality is messier, truth is harder. Chapter 10. Truth, Trust, and Institutions. Strip away the allegations about giants and lost civilizations. Remove the claims of destroyed evidence and hidden artifacts. What remains is a deeper, more fundamental question that the conspiracy theories dance around without directly addressing. Who do we trust to tell history? And what happens when that trust proves conditional? The Smithsonian Institution shapes how millions of Americans understand the past. Its exhibits become common knowledge, the background facts that educated people are expected to know. Its publications influence textbooks that shape what children learn. Its researchers appear in documentaries, offering expert testimony that carries the weight of institutional authority. This is enormous power. Power to define what is important and what is trivial. Power to determine which narratives enter public consciousness and which remain known only to specialists. Power to shape collective memory. But authority is not infallibility, and trust should not mean blind acceptance. Institutions are made of people. People have biases, blind spots, career incentives, and social pressures. People make decisions based not only on evidence but on feasibility, palatability, and institutional priorities. Organizations develop cultures. Some questions become acceptable to ask, others uncomfortable. Some conclusions are easy to support, others require defending against skeptical colleagues. Some research directions receive funding and encouragement, others face obstacles. This doesn't make institutions evil, it makes them human. And humanity involves limitation. The conspiracy theories about the Smithsonian often miss this nuance. They imagine a shadowy group deliberately hiding truth, making conscious decisions to deceive the public. The reality is probably more mundane and in some ways more troubling. Not conspiracy, but culture. A culture that values consensus over disruption. That prefers established narratives over unsettling questions. That makes conservative choices about what to emphasize and what to set aside. Over time, those individual choices accumulate. They create a version of history that is coherent, comfortable, and teachable. But is it complete? Is it accurate in all its particulars? Or does it sometimes smooth over complications, avoid uncertainties, and privilege certain stories over others? We know the Smithsonian has changed its positions before. Archaeological understanding has evolved. Theories once considered mainstream are now rejected. Evidence once dismissed has been re-evaluated and accepted. The Clovis first model, which held that humans first arrived in the Americas around 13,000 years ago, was institutionally supported for decades. Evidence of earlier occupation was viewed skeptically. Sites suggesting pre-Clovis presence faced extraordinary scrutiny. Then accumulating evidence became overwhelming. Monteverde in Chile, genetic data showing multiple migration waves, pre-Clovis artifacts in North America. The paradigm shifted. Institutions including the Smithsonian adjusted their positions. This is how science should work. Self-correction through new evidence and better methods. But it also means what institutions tell us today is subject to revision tomorrow. What we're told is established fact might be updated or overturned in the future. If institutions can be wrong, the question becomes, how do we know when they are? How do we distinguish between legitimate scientific consensus and institutional inertia protecting incorrect conclusions? This is genuinely difficult. We cannot all become experts in every field. We must rely on authorities. But uncritical reliance creates vulnerability to institutional mistakes and biases. The healthy middle path involves respecting expertise while maintaining critical awareness, trusting institutional knowledge while understanding its limitations, accepting scientific consensus as the best current understanding while remaining open to revision, distinguishing between conspiracy theories and legitimate critiques of institutional practices. This requires nuance. It requires holding seemingly contradictory ideas simultaneously. Institutions deserve scrutiny and their claims should be questioned. And also, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and skepticism applies to conspiracy theories too. The Smithsonian's darkest secret might not be hidden artifacts or destroyed evidence. It might be something simpler and more universal. The impossibility of perfect transparency in an institution managing millions of items, nearly 2 centuries of history, and the weight of public expectation. How can any organisation be fully accountable when the task itself is overwhelming? How can curators document every decision when making thousands daily? How can researchers address every anomaly when resources are limited and priorities must be set? The gaps in the record aren't necessarily evidence of conspiracy. They might be evidence of limitation, of the inevitable imperfections of any human endeavour operating at massive scale across generations. But limitation can enable concealment. Disorganisation can achieve what conspiracy would require, and we cannot easily distinguish between innocent chaos and deliberate obscuration from outside the institution. This uncertainty is uncomfortable. We want clear answers. We want to know whether to trust or distrust. We want institutions to be either reliable authorities or proven frauds. Reality offers neither certainty. Institutions are fallible but often reliable, sometimes wrong but frequently right, deserving of trust but requiring oversight. The conspiracy theories offer escape from this ambiguity. They promise that truth is clear, just hidden. They suggest that uncertainty is manufactured rather than inherent. But the real world is uncertain. The past is fragmentary. Our knowledge is incomplete and probably always will be. The question isn't whether the Smithsonian is perfectly trustworthy. No institution is. The question is whether it operates with reasonable integrity, corrects mistakes when identified, and serves its stated mission of preserving and sharing knowledge despite inevitable human limitations. The evidence suggests it does, imperfectly but genuinely. The conspiracy theories suggest it doesn't, perfectly and deliberately. Which interpretation fits the available evidence better? Which is more consistent with how institutions actually function? The truth, as usual, resists simplicity. Epilogue: the locked vault question. Deep in the Smithsonian storage facilities, there are rooms most visitors never see, will never see, cannot see without explicit permission and documented research purpose. Rows of metal shelving holding thousands of cardboard boxes, climate-controlled spaces preserving fragile specimens from light, moisture and temperature fluctuations, cabinets filled with items waiting for study, cataloguing, or simply space in public galleries that may never come. The institution holds 140 million objects. This number is almost incomprehensible. If you spent 1 second looking at each item, it would take over 4.5 years of continuous observation without sleep. Only a tiny fraction is ever displayed. Most sit in storage, accessible to researchers by appointment, but invisible to the general public. Out of sight, out of mind. What's in those boxes? Mostly the expected. Pottery shards catalogued by culture and approximate date. Stone tools labelled by type and location. Skeletal remains stored according to established protocols. Textile fragments preserved in acid-free containers. The ordinary artefacts of ordinary lives, collectively telling stories about how people lived, worked, created and died. But also inevitably anomalies. Things that don't fit neat categories. Items with unclear provenance that make definitive conclusions difficult. Specimens that raise more questions than they answer. Questions that current methodologies cannot adequately address. Some of these anomalies get studied. Grad students write dissertations. Papers appear in specialised journals. Mysteries get solved or at least better understood. The anomaly becomes integrated into knowledge, explained and categorised. Some sit, waiting. Waiting for the right scholar with the right question. Waiting for new analytical technology that might reveal secrets current methods cannot detect. Waiting for someone to notice them among millions of other items competing for attention. And some, perhaps, are simply forgotten, not destroyed, not hidden, not deliberately concealed, just overlooked, set aside and never retrieved, lost in the vast bureaucracy of an organisation managing more material than any human mind can fully grasp. The conspiracy. Theory imagines intention, a deliberate choice to conceal. Curators meeting in shadowy rooms, deciding what truth the public can handle. Artifacts quietly destroyed to protect established narratives. The reality might be more banal and somehow more troubling. Neglect. The passive erasure that comes from having too much to manage and too few resources to manage it. The slow forgetting that happens when things sit unopened in boxes for decades. Either way, the effect approaches similarity. If something didn't fit the story of human history, if it challenged our understanding in ways we weren't ready to confront, if it required explanation that current paradigms couldn't provide, would we know if it disappeared into those storage rooms? Would we know if it was catalogued under a description that doesn't capture its significance? Filed in a location that makes it unlikely to be found? Assigned to a box that hasn't been opened since it was sealed decades ago? The Smithsonian maintains it operates with integrity. Its researchers are scientists, not censors. Its mission is knowledge, not narrative control. Its purpose is preserving truth, not concealing it. And they're probably right, in the overwhelming majority of cases. For the vast majority of decisions made daily by people trying their best under difficult circumstances, but probably and mostly an overwhelming majority, are not the same as certainly and always in every single case. The institution remains largely silent on specific conspiracy claims. It doesn't engage extensively with allegations it considers baseless. It lets its scientific work speak for itself. It maintains that those seeking evidence of wrongdoing will find none because none exists. The debate continues regardless, not because of evidence which remains absent, but because of doubt, which once planted grows deeper roots than any fact. And doubt has many sources: the documented gaps in records, the missing artifacts, described in century-old reports, the patterns of what receives attention versus what doesn't, the natural human tendency to distrust concentrated authority, the genuine mysteries that remain unexplained, the history of mistakes and course corrections, the simple fact that perfect transparency is impossible in any institution of this scale. In the end, we're left with questions that may never find definitive answers. Do we trust institutions to tell us the truth about the past? Can we trust them, given that they're human enterprises subject to all the failings humanity entails? Do we believe that everything discovered has been preserved and honestly presented? Do we accept that our understanding of history might be incomplete, not from conspiracy, but from the simple limitations of human knowledge and institutional capacity? Or do we wonder what sits in those boxes no one opens? What lies forgotten in storage areas that haven't been fully inventoried? What truths might be waiting in plain sight, catalogued too vaguely to be found? The Smithsonian's doors remain open. Its collections are vast. Its researchers welcome serious inquiry from qualified scholars. It has processes for access, review, and study. But the vaults are deep. The records are incomplete. The collections are massive beyond full comprehension. And the past, once gone, speaks only through what we choose to preserve and how we choose to interpret it. These choices, made over decades by thousands of individuals operating within institutional cultures and constraints, have shaped what we know and what we don't. Whether those choices were always made with perfect integrity, whether they were free from bias and political pressure, whether they prioritized truth over comfort in every instance, we cannot know with certainty from outside the institution. We can examine the evidence, evaluate the arguments, and reach conclusions about what seems most probable. But absolute certainty escapes us. As it does in most things worth thinking about deeply. Sleep well tonight. And remember, history is written by those who control the archives. And sometimes, the most important question isn't what we know. It's what we'll never know we lost. The boxes sit in climate-controlled darkness. Their contents waiting. Their stories untold. Perhaps someday, someone will open them. Perhaps they already have, and found nothing of significance. Or perhaps they found something that changed everything, and we simply haven't heard about it yet. The vaults keep their secrets, and we are left to wonder